Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The headlights of my Ford pickup swept across the driveway as I pulled in around 11 that Thursday night in October. I'd been putting in overtime at the warehouse for weeks, trying to save up enough to finally fix the roof before winter hit Colorado Springs hard. My wife Diane had taken the kids to her mother's place in Denver for the week, something about needing space to think about our marriage, which left me alone in that old two-story house my father had left me when he passed in 2014. The silence in the empty house had been getting to me lately, so I'd been staying late at work just to avoid it. As I cut the engine and grabbed my thermos from the passenger seat, movement in my peripheral vision made me pause. Someone was standing at the edge of my driveway, perfectly still, just watching my house like they were studying it for a test. It took me a second to recognize him in the darkness, but when I did, my whole body tensed up like I'd touched a live wire. Craig Novak, my next-door neighbor from before everything went to hell, was standing there in a worn denim jacket and jeans that hung loose on his frame. Prison had taken at least 30 pounds off him, and his hair, which used to be this wild mane he was so proud of, was now buzz-cut short and gray at the temples. He must have gotten out recently because I hadn't seen him around, and trust me, I would have noticed. The last time I'd seen Craig was 7 years ago when they loaded him into the police car after what he did. That night changed everything for my family. My dad never fully recovered from the head injury Craig gave him with that baseball bat during his drunken rampage, and watching him deteriorate over the following years, until his death was probably the hardest thing I've ever had to endure. I stayed in the truck for a moment, keys in my fist, debating whether to just back out and drive somewhere else until he left. But this was my house, my property, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me on my own land. When I stepped out, Craig raised both hands in this slow, deliberate way, palms facing me like he was trying to calm a spooked horse. The porch light from his house cast these long shadows across his face, making the hollows under his cheekbones look deeper than they probably were. He'd always been a big guy, the kind who used his size to get his way in arguments. But now there was something different about how he carried himself, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening. The October wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the asphalt between us, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something else on him, maybe cheap cologne trying to mask something worse. Craig took a step forward, still keeping his hands visible, and his voice came out rougher than I remembered, like he'd been gargling gravel. He said he'd been out for 3 weeks, staying at a halfway house downtown at first, but he'd moved back into his old place just yesterday because his mother had kept up the payments while he was gone. The old woman had died 2 years into his sentence, he told me, but she'd made sure he had somewhere to come back to. He kept talking, saying he'd found God inside, that he was in AA now, that he understood what he'd taken from me and my family. Every word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in the mirror 100 times. He wanted to make amends, he said, part of his 12-step program, and he pulled out this crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, holding it out to me like it was supposed to mean something. I didn't move to take it, just stood there with my truck door still open behind me, ready to bolt if necessary. The paper fluttered in his hand as the wind picked up again, and I could see writing on it, probably some letter his sponsor made him write or something. Craig's eyes kept darting between my face and the ground, never quite settling on either. And there was this twitch in his left cheek that hadn't been there before. When I didn't take the paper, he slowly lowered his hand and shoved it back in his pocket, but he didn't leave. Instead, he started talking about my dad, about how he remembered him working on cars in the garage on weekends, how he used to wave when Craig jogged by in the mornings before everything went bad. He said my father was a good man who didn't deserve what happened, and that he thought about that night every single day in his cell. The streetlight buzzed overhead, casting this sickly orange glow over everything, and I noticed Craig's knuckles were scarred in ways they hadn't been before, covered in these white lines that looked like a roadmap of violence. I finally found my voice and told him to get off my property, that whatever program he was working didn't require my participation or forgiveness. My words came out steadier than I felt, but my jaw was clenched so tight I could hear my teeth grinding. Craig nodded like he'd expected this, backing away with his hand still raised, saying he understood, that he'd be next door if I ever wanted to talk. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. He mentioned he'd noticed my tool shed door had been open earlier that day when he was moving boxes in, and he'd closed it for me to keep animals out. I hadn't been home all day, and I always locked that shed because that's where I kept my father's tools, the ones he'd collected over 40 years of working construction. The thought of Craig anywhere near those tools, touching things that belonged to my dad, made me want to put my fist through something. After he disappeared into his house, I went straight to the shed with my phone flashlight, my breath coming out in white puffs in the cold air. The padlock was still there, locked like I'd left it that morning, but when I opened it and stepped inside, something was wrong. The tools were all there, hanging on their designated hooks just like my father had organized them. But his favorite hammer, the Estwing with the leather-wrapped handle he'd bought in 1975, was on the workbench instead of its hook. A thin layer of dust on the bench showed the outline where it had been placed recently. My father never left tools out, and neither did I. It was like muscle memory to put everything back exactly where it belonged. I picked up the hammer, feeling its familiar weight, and noticed something else. There were fresh scratches on the wooden handle, like someone had been gripping it too tight or maybe practicing swinging it. The next few days passed in this weird state of hypervigilance where I found myself checking locks twice, 3 times, before leaving for work. I installed a cheap security camera from Walmart, one of those that sends alerts to your phone, pointing it at the shed and driveway. Craig kept his distance, but I'd see him sometimes through the kitchen window, sitting on his porch smoking cigarettes and staring at nothing, or at least pretending to. Then things started disappearing. First, it was small stuff I could almost explain away. The garden hose nozzle I knew I'd left attached was gone, then showed up 2 days later, hanging on Craig's fence like it had been there all along. A pair of work gloves vanished from my truck bed, then appeared stuffed in my mailbox, damp with morning dew. Each time I thought about confronting him, but what would I say? That I was pretty sure he was stealing things just to return them. The police would laugh me out of the station. The security camera started picking up movement at night, but never anything definitive. Just shadows at the edge of its range, or sometimes a blur that could have been a cat or raccoon. But one night around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the notification sound and checked my phone to see Craig standing in my driveway, completely still, facing my house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there in pajama pants and a white t-shirt, barefoot despite the near-freezing temperature. I watched him through the live feed for 20 minutes and he never moved once, not even to shift his weight. His eyes were open but unfocused, and for a moment I wondered if he was sleepwalking. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, he turned and walked back to his house, moving normally like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, just sat in my living room with my father's old shotgun across my lap, watching the windows. I called Diane the next morning, trying to keep my voice casual as I told her maybe she should stay at her mother's a bit longer. She asked if everything was all right, and I could hear the concern creeping into her voice, but I just said work was crazy, and I didn't want the kids to see me so stressed. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. How could I explain that our ex-con neighbor was playing some psychological game that I couldn't quite prove? The night after that phone call, my motion sensor lights kept triggering, one after another in sequence, like someone was walking circles around my house. Front porch, side yard, back deck, other side, then front porch again. Each time I looked out, nobody was there, but I could smell cigarette smoke through the cracked window, that same brand Craig had been chain smoking on his porch. The camera only showed empty yards and swaying shadows from the trees, but those lights didn't trigger from wind. Then came that Saturday morning. I'd actually managed to sleep for a few hours, exhaustion finally overwhelming paranoia, when I heard something scratching at the front door. Not knocking, scratching like a dog wanting to be let in. When I looked through the peephole, nobody was there, but there was something white on the porch. I grabbed the shotgun, checked through all the windows to make sure Craig wasn't lurking nearby, then cracked the door open. It was a piece of notebook paper, folded once, weighted down with a rock from my own garden. My mouth went dry as I picked it up and read the single line written in pencil, the handwriting shaky like someone had written it with their non-dominant hand. I still remember that night too. That's all it said, but it was enough to make my knees weak. Because Craig had been blackout drunk that night 7 years ago. So drunk he claimed in court, he didn't remember anything about attacking my father. His whole defense had been built on that claim, that he had no memory of breaking down our back door and coming after my dad with the bat from my own garage. I went straight to Craig's house, not even bothering to put on shoes, pounding on his door hard enough to shake the frame. When he answered, he looked genuinely confused, his hair sticking up at odd angles like he'd just woken up. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and wearing reading glasses I'd never seen before, looking for all the world like any harmless middle-aged man on a Saturday morning. When I shoved the note in his face demanding to know what kind of sick game he was playing, he squinted at it, then looked back at me with what seemed like real bewilderment. He swore he didn't write it, said he'd been at his AA meeting until late last night and had his sponsor's number if I wanted to verify. He even offered to show me his notebook where he kept his step work, holding it out with hands that weren't shaking at all. The handwriting in his notebook was completely different, neat and precise where the note's writing was chaotic. But when he reached for the note to look at it closer, I saw something that made everything else fade away. Under his fingernails there was dust, the same distinctive reddish construction dust that covered everything in my father's tool shed. I backed away from his door without saying another word, my mind racing faster than my feet as I crossed back to my property. Craig called after me, asking what was wrong, still playing his innocent act. But I didn't turn around. Inside my house, I called my old friend Tom, who worked for the sheriff's department, told him everything that had been happening, including the dust under Craig's nails. Tom listened without interrupting, then said something that changed everything. There had been 3 other reports in the past 2 weeks from families in the neighborhood, all describing similar experiences with items being moved, notes being left, someone standing in their yards at night. The thing was, Craig had solid alibis for all of those incidents, verified by multiple witnesses at his halfway house or AA meetings. Tom asked me to check something, to look for any medications in my bathroom that might have been moved or tampered with. That's when I found it. My prescription sleep medication that I'd stopped taking months ago was nearly empty when it should have been almost full. Tom came by that afternoon with another detective, and they found something I'd never have thought to look for. There were small holes drilled in the fence between Craig's yard and mine, painted over to match the wood, but positioned perfectly to watch my house from his bedroom window. They also found a journal in Craig's room, hidden inside an old heating vent, where he'd documented everything about our family for years before he went to prison, including detailed observations about my father's routines, my work schedule, even notes about which lights we left on at night. The really sick part was that he'd been planning this since before he got out, had written about how he was going to make me understand what it felt like to lose someone slowly, to watch them deteriorate like my father had. But he'd been smart about it, making sure he had alibis, probably using the sleep medication he'd been stealing to make sure I'd be groggy enough not to catch him. The dust under his nails was his only mistake, probably from his last visit to the shed that morning before I confronted him. They arrested Craig that evening for criminal harassment, breaking and entering, and theft of prescription medication. As they led him to the police car, he didn't say a word, just stared at me with this blank expression that was somehow worse than anger would have been. His lawyer got him a plea deal for 2 years with mandatory psychiatric treatment, which seemed like nothing compared to what he'd put me through. But at least it got him away from my family. I changed all the locks, installed a real security system, and patched every one of those holes in the fence myself. Diane and the kids came home the following week, and I told her everything, showed her the police reports and the photos of Craig's journal. She held me for a long time that night, both of us realizing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't noticed that dust under his fingernails. The house feels different now, even with Craig gone. Sometimes I still check the locks 3 times before bed, and I replaced every tool in that shed. Couldn't stand touching the ones he'd handled. But the worst part is knowing he'll get out again someday, and that journal showed he's patient enough to wait years for his revenge. Tom told me Craig's obsession started because my father had called the cops on him once for a domestic dispute years before the attack, something I never even knew about. Such a small thing that led to all of this. I've been teaching Diane how to use the security system and bought her pepper spray for her keychain. We're thinking about moving, maybe somewhere across town or even out of state. But for now, we're taking it one day at a time. At least now I know I wasn't losing my mind, that every instinct telling me something was wrong had been right. Sometimes that's all you can hold on to, the knowledge that you trusted yourself when it mattered most. The cardboard boxes were still stacked against the living room wall when Brandon first knocked on our door that September afternoon. My roommate Kevin and I had just signed the lease 3 days earlier, desperate to find something affordable after our previous landlord decided to sell. The place on Willow Court wasn't much to look at, just a standard 2-bedroom in a complex built sometime during the Reagan administration, but the rent was manageable and it was only 20 minutes from both our jobs. Kevin answered the door while I was untangling Ethernet cables, and I heard this overly enthusiastic voice introducing himself as our across-the-hall neighbor. When I walked over to say hello, Brandon was holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil, grinning like we were long-lost relatives at a family reunion. He was probably mid-40s, wearing a polo shirt tucked into khakis that looked like they'd been ironed with military precision, and he had this way of maintaining eye contact for just a beat too long. Kevin and I exchanged glances while Brandon launched into a detailed history of every tenant who'd lived in our unit for the past 6 years. He knew their names, their jobs, where they'd moved afterward, even what kind of car the previous couple drove. The casserole dish grew heavy in his hands as he talked, but he never set it down, just kept holding it out like an offering, while describing how quiet the building usually was, how the mail carrier came at exactly 2:15 every day except Sundays, how the dumpsters got emptied on Wednesdays at 6 in the morning sharp. When he finally handed over the casserole and left, Kevin immediately Googled whether you could hide cameras in food. We laughed about it then, joking that we'd already found the complex's resident weirdo. The casserole was actually pretty good, some kind of chicken and rice thing with too much cheese, and we figured Brandon was just lonely. Lots of single middle-aged guys get awkward around people, especially younger folks who remind them of what they used to be. Neither of us touched the second casserole he brought the next day. The gifts started appearing about a week later. First, it was a 6-pack of craft beer left on our doormat with a sticky note that said, "Noticed you guys carrying Sierra Nevada upstairs. Thought you might enjoy these." The thing was, we'd carried those beers up at 11:30 at night after a late grocery run. Then came the magazine subscriptions we never ordered, all addressed to us, but clearly paid for by someone else. Sports Illustrated for Kevin because Brandon had seen him wearing a Lakers jersey once. Wired for me after he'd spotted an old Arduino kit through our window when the blinds were cracked. Each gift came with these little notes demonstrating just how much attention he was paying to our daily routines. He knew Kevin left for his shift at the hospital at 6:45 each morning. He knew I worked from home on Fridays and always ordered Thai food from the place on Riverside Drive. The notes were always cheerful, always signed with a smiley face, always written in this perfect elementary school teacher handwriting that made my neck tense up. Kevin started keeping a log after Brandon showed up at his gym across town. Not the community center 5 minutes away, not the Planet Fitness by the grocery store, but the specific CrossFit box in Northside where Kevin had been going for months before we moved. Brandon claimed it was pure coincidence, said his cousin had recommended the place, but he somehow ended up in Kevin's same morning class 3 days in a row. He'd position himself at the next station during circuits, offering form tips and asking about Kevin's workout history, his diet, whether I ever joined him for sessions. The owner told Kevin that Brandon had specifically asked about the schedule for the tall black guy who drives the blue Mazda before signing up for a membership. That same week I ran into Brandon at the coffee shop where I sometimes worked in the afternoons when the apartment got too stuffy. He walked in carrying a laptop I'd never seen him use before, acted surprised to see me there, then sat at the table directly behind mine for 3 hours without ordering anything after his initial coffee. We decided to talk to the property manager after the laundry room incident. It was a Monday night, close to 2 in the morning, and I couldn't sleep because of a project deadline. I figured I'd throw in a load of clothes since no one else would be using the machines at that hour. The laundry room was in the basement, lit by these harsh fluorescent tubes that made everything look greenish, and you had to walk past the storage units to get there. I was loading quarters into the washer when I heard breathing behind me. Brandon was standing in the doorway wearing pajama pants and a white undershirt, holding an empty laundry basket. No detergent, no clothes, just the basket pressed against his stomach. He said he couldn't sleep either, asked if I wanted company while my clothes washed. When I said I was heading right back upstairs, he mentioned that Kevin had seemed stressed lately, wondered if we were having roommate problems, if maybe I needed someone to talk to about it. The whole time he was blocking the doorway, not aggressively, just standing there like he'd forgotten how doorways worked. I had to say excuse me 3 times before he stepped aside. The property manager, Nancy, acted like we were overreacting until we showed her Kevin's log. 3 pages of dates and times, Brandon appearing at the mailboxes whenever we checked mail, Brandon carrying groceries to his door at the exact moment we'd come home from shopping, Brandon taking out trash that couldn't have been full because he'd emptied it 12 hours earlier. Nancy's expression changed when she read about the gym and the coffee shop. She said she'd talk to him, give him a warning about respecting boundaries. 2 days later, Brandon knocked on our door to apologize. He brought homemade cookies this time, chocolate chip with walnuts, and his apology was so detailed it became its own form of harassment. He apologized for making us uncomfortable at the gym, at the coffee shop, in the laundry room at 2:18 in the morning on Monday. He knew the exact times, the exact locations, even mentioned things we hadn't told Nancy about, like how he'd accidentally walked behind me to my car after work the previous Friday, or how he'd happened to be at the same gas station Kevin used on Sunday mornings. Each apology contained information that proved he was still watching, still cataloging our movements, still treating our lives like a TV show he couldn't stop binging. Things went quiet for about a week after that. Brandon stopped appearing everywhere, stopped leaving gifts, even seemed to avoid eye contact when we passed in the hallway. Kevin thought maybe Nancy's warning had actually worked, but I kept feeling this weight in my chest whenever I came home. The silence felt intentional, calculated, like when a storm suddenly stops and you know something worse is coming. Then Kevin noticed his bike had been moved in the storage room. Not stolen, just shifted 3 spaces over from where he'd locked it. The chain wrapped differently than he always did it. I found a receipt from a hardware store tucked under my windshield wiper one morning, paid in cash, for items I couldn't quite make out because the ink was smudged. The timestamp showed it was purchased at 3:47 in the morning. We started finding these little signs that someone had been in spaces we thought were ours. A window we never opened was cracked 1/2 inch. The welcome mat was turned at a different angle. Kevin's laundry detergent was fuller than it should have been, like someone had added more to it. We installed a doorbell camera without telling Nancy. Figured we needed proof before anyone would take us seriously. The first few nights showed nothing unusual, just us coming and going, the occasional delivery driver, a few other tenants passing by. But on the fourth night, the motion sensor triggered at 3:22 in the morning. Brandon was standing directly in front of our door, not moving, not knocking, just standing there facing the door like he was listening. He stayed for exactly 12 minutes, then walked back to his apartment. The next night, 3:22 again, 14 minutes this time. He never looked at the camera, kept his head tilted slightly down, but we could see his lips moving like he was having a conversation. Kevin wanted to call the police right then, but I convinced him to wait until we had more footage. We needed them to understand this wasn't just a neighbor being friendly or confused. The third night, Brandon showed up with something in his hand. He knelt down and slipped what looked like a folded piece of paper under our door, then stood up and pressed his palm flat against the door for almost 30 seconds before walking away. The paper was a printed screenshot of Kevin's Instagram story from 2 years ago, before we'd even met each other, before either of us had heard of Willow Court. It showed Kevin at some beach in California with friends, and someone had drawn red circles around everyone's faces except Kevin's. On the back, in that same perfect handwriting, it said, "They don't deserve you." We found 4 more papers throughout the day, slipped into places Brandon shouldn't have been able to access. One in Kevin's gym bag that had been locked in his car. One inside my laptop case in the apartment. One folded into the exact middle page of a book I was reading. The last one was in our freezer, wrapped in plastic, placed between 2 boxes of frozen vegetables we'd bought the day before. That one was a photo of me from high school that I'd never posted online, standing in front of my parents' house in Ohio. I hadn't been back there in 7 years. The only copy of that photo existed in an album my mom kept in her basement. Kevin called the police while I threw up in the bathroom, my whole body shuddering as I tried to figure out how Brandon could have gotten that picture. The officers who came seemed skeptical, until we showed them the doorbell footage and the photos. They took our statements, looked at Kevin's log, said they'd go talk to Brandon. We watched through the peephole as they knocked on his door across the hall. No answer. They knocked again, announced themselves, waited. After 10 minutes, they told us Brandon wasn't home and they'd try again later. But 20 minutes after the police left, we heard Brandon's door open and close. He'd been in there the whole time, just refusing to answer. That night, neither of us slept. We pushed the couch against the door and took turns staying awake. Kevin with a baseball bat he'd bought that afternoon, me with my phone ready to call 911. Around 4 in the morning, we heard footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside our door. The doorbell camera alert went off on my phone. Brandon was back, but this time he was holding something up to the peephole. It was another photo, this one of Kevin and me inside our apartment, taken from a high angle like it was shot from the ceiling, showing us watching TV on the couch just 2 nights earlier. Kevin lost it. He yanked the couch away from the door and stormed into the hallway, but Brandon was already gone. That's when Kevin looked up at the smoke detector mounted between our door and Brandon's. Something seemed wrong about it. The LED light that usually blinked green was dark, and the casing looked slightly newer than the one further down the hall. Kevin grabbed a stepladder from our apartment and climbed up while I held it steady. When he popped open the detector's cover, a small camera fell out and dangled by its wire. Not just a basic camera either, but something sophisticated with night vision capabilities and a wide-angle lens. We checked the other detector near the stairwell and found another one. These weren't just watching our door. They were angled to see through the gap under it when we opened it, to catch glimpses inside our apartment. Kevin called 911 while I ran to Nancy's unit and pounded on her door until she answered in her robe. The police arrived within minutes this time, and Nancy used her master key to open Brandon's apartment when he wouldn't respond. The place was empty. Not just that he wasn't home, but completely empty. No furniture, no clothes, nothing except hundreds of photos taped to every wall. The photos covered 3 years of Kevin's life and 18 months of mine, long before we'd moved to Willow Court. Pictures from grocery stores, from previous apartments, from family gatherings we'd attended in different states. There were detailed notes written directly on the walls in permanent marker, documenting our routines, our preferences, our relationships. One wall was dedicated entirely to analyzing Kevin's workout schedule and dietary habits. Another mapped out my work patterns and coffee shop visits across 3 different cities I'd lived in. The police found Brandon's real name was Aaron Fitzgerald, and he'd been renting the apartment for 4 years, going through tenant after tenant, selecting certain ones to document. They found external hard drives with thousands of hours of footage from the smoke detector cameras and others he'd hidden in the laundry room vents and stairwell emergency lights. Nancy broke down crying when she realized he'd been doing this under her watch. We stayed in a hotel that night while the police processed the scene. They arrested Aaron 2 days later at a storage facility 40 miles away, where he'd been living in a modified unit, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from cameras he'd installed in 2 other apartment complexes. We moved out before the week ended, broke our lease without penalty, and found a house to rent on the other side of the city. Sometimes I still check doorways twice and look up at smoke detectors longer than I should, but at least now when someone knocks on our door with cookies, it's just a neighbor being friendly. The divorce had been finalized just after my 31st birthday, and finding an affordable place in a decent school district felt like winning the lottery. My daughter Lily was 7, still young enough to think moving was an adventure, and she'd spent the first week in our new house exploring every corner while I unpacked boxes. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets lined with oak trees, kids riding bikes after school. The kind of place where people actually waved when they passed you on the sidewalk. Our next-door neighbor, an older man named Harold, had introduced himself the day we moved in, bringing over a casserole dish and telling me how nice it was to have a family in the neighborhood again. Harold must have been in his 70s, thin and stooped with age, always wearing the same beige cardigan no matter the weather. He lived alone in the house to our right, kept his lawn immaculate, and seemed to spend most of his time tending to his garden or sitting on his porch with his orange tabby cat. At first, I appreciated having a friendly neighbor, especially one who seemed so harmless and grandfatherly. He'd wave from his porch when Lily played in the yard, sometimes calling out compliments about what a well-behaved child she was, how lucky I was to have such a sweet little girl. I'd smile and wave back, grateful that at least one person in this new place had made us feel welcome. The interaction started small, innocent enough that I barely noticed the pattern forming. Harold would appear at the fence whenever Lily was outside, holding a plate of homemade sugar cookies, the kind with pink frosting and sprinkles that kids go crazy for. He'd lean over the chain-link fence separating our yards, his weathered hands gripping the metal. Calling out to her in that raspy voice of his, Lily would run over, delighted by the attention and treats, while I watched from the kitchen window, telling myself this was just what neighbors did in places like this. He started mentioning his cat, Whiskers, saying how lonely the poor thing got during the day, wondering if maybe Lily would like to come over sometime and keep him company. Then came the toys, little things at first. A rubber ball that had supposedly rolled into his yard months ago, a set of colored pencils he claimed to have found while cleaning his garage. Each time he'd wait until I was inside or distracted, approaching Lily directly with these gifts, always with a story about why she should have them. One afternoon, I came outside to find him teaching her how to make a cat's cradle with string, their heads bent close together, his fingers guiding hers through the patterns. The sight made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. Watching this old man's hands touching my daughter's, even for something as innocent as a string game. When I called Lily inside, Harold straightened up slowly, that permanent smile of his never wavering, and mentioned he'd be going out of town soon, wondering if Lily might want to feed Whiskers while he was gone. That evening, after Lily was in bed, I sat at my laptop with a glass of wine. telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting the stress of the divorce and the move turn me into one of those helicopter parents. But my fingers typed his name into the search bar anyway, Harold Garrison, along with our street address. The first few results were nothing, some mentions in local gardening club newsletters, a photo from a community barbecue 5 years ago. But then I found it. Buried on the third page of results, a news article from 2018 about complaints filed against a Harold Garrison in a neighboring county. The details were vague. Something about inappropriate behavior around minors at a public pool, charges that were dropped when witnesses failed to appear in court. My mouth went dry as I clicked through to another link. A community forum post warning about an elderly man matching Harold's description, who'd been seen taking photos of children at a playground. I spent the next hour digging deeper, finding fragments of information that painted an increasingly unsettling picture. There were 2 more incidents. One from 2016, where he'd been asked to leave a youth center after parents complained about him offering to give swimming lessons to young girls. Another from just last year, where police had questioned him about loitering near an elementary school. Nothing had ever stuck. No convictions, no registered offender status, just a trail of complaints and suspicions that followed him from town to town. The wine glass sat forgotten beside me as I stared at the screen, my mind racing through every interaction he'd had with Lily, every cookie, every toy, every moment I'd left them alone together even for a second. The string game kept replaying in my head, his spotted hands manipulating the yarn around my daughter's small fingers, and I had to run to the bathroom, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and rage. After splashing cold water on my face, I went to check on Lily, needing to see her safe in her bed, her stuffed elephant clutched to her chest, breathing steadily in the glow of her nightlight. I pulled her door nearly closed and went to every window in the house, checking locks, pulling curtains tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. From the kitchen window, I could see Harold's house, dark except for a single light in what I assumed was his living room. As I watched, the curtain moved slightly, and I jerked back, even though I knew he couldn't possibly see me in the darkened kitchen. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts, wondering who I could call, what I could say. The police would want evidence, something more than old complaints and dropped charges, and I had nothing concrete, just a mother's instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. Sleep was impossible that night, every small sound making me jump, every car passing on the street sending me to peek through the blinds. Around 2 a.m, I heard a door close softly, and when I crept to the front window, I saw Harold's porch light on, though I couldn't see him anywhere. I stood there for 20 minutes watching, waiting, until finally the light clicked off and everything went quiet again. The next morning, I kept Lily inside despite the beautiful weather, making up excuses about needing her help with organizing her room. Harold appeared in his garden around 10, pruning his roses with methodical precision, occasionally glancing toward our house. When Lily asked if she could go outside and play, I told her maybe later, my voice too bright, too forced, and she gave me that look kids get when they know something's wrong, but adults won't explain what. The day dragged on with painful slowness, Lily growing increasingly restless and cranky from being cooped up inside. I tried to distract her with movies and baking projects, but my attention kept drifting to the windows, checking if Harold was still out there. He seemed to be finding every possible reason to stay in his front yard, sweeping his already spotless walkway, adjusting his garden hose, trimming bushes that didn't need trimming. Around 4 p.m, he knocked on our door, and I watched through the peephole as he stood there holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, that same benign smile plastered on his face. I didn't answer, holding my breath, one hand pressed against Lily's mouth when she started to ask who was at the door. He knocked again, waited, then finally left the plate on our doorstep and shuffled back to his house. Later, when I was sure he'd gone inside, I quickly grabbed the plate and threw it directly in the garbage, cookies and all. As evening approached, I made dinner while Lily colored at the kitchen table, Her mood improved by the promise of ice cream for dessert if she ate all her vegetables. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple when movement outside caught my eye. Harold was standing on the sidewalk directly across from our house, not on his property, not walking anywhere, just standing there facing our front door. He wasn't doing anything threatening, technically, just standing on a public sidewalk, but the deliberateness of it, the way he positioned himself with a clear view of our entrance, made my skin prickle with alarm. I pulled out my phone and started recording through the kitchen window, needing some kind of proof, some documentation of this behavior. He stood there for 43 minutes. I know because I filmed the entire time, my phone growing hot in my grip, until finally a couple walking their dog approached and he turned, walking slowly back toward his house, as if he'd just been out for an evening stroll. That night, after triple checking every lock and moving a chair against the front door, I called my ex-husband, something I'd sworn I wouldn't do unless it was an absolute emergency. I explained everything, the research I'd found, the standing and watching, how Harold seemed to be escalating his interest in Lily. My ex listened, then said what I knew he would say, that without concrete evidence, without Harold actually doing something illegal, there wasn't much anyone could do. He suggested I install security cameras, maybe talk to other neighbors, see if anyone else had noticed anything strange. After we hung up, I sat in Lily's doorway watching her sleep, my laptop open as I ordered cameras for next day delivery, along with new deadbolts and window locks. I dozed off there sometime after 3, waking with a stiff neck when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number that just said, "She looked lovely in her pink pajamas yesterday." My entire body went rigid as I read the message again, then looked down at Lily, who was indeed wearing her pink unicorn pajamas, the same ones she'd worn yesterday morning when I'd let her grab the newspaper from the porch. I screenshotted the message, my fingers trembling as I called 911, finally having something concrete to report. The police arrived within 15 minutes, 2 officers who took my statement and looked at all the evidence I'd gathered. They went next door to talk to Harold, and I watched from my window as he answered his door in his bathrobe, looking confused and frail, shaking his head repeatedly. When they came back, they told me he claimed to know nothing about any text message, that he didn't even own a cell phone, just his landline. They said they'd file a report, suggested I keep documenting everything, and mentioned I might want to consider a restraining order, though without proof he'd sent the message, it would be difficult to obtain. After they left, I packed 2 suitcases, grabbed Lily, still in her pajamas, and drove to my sister's house 3 hours away, leaving the cameras and locks in their delivery boxes on the porch, deciding that no house, no matter how perfect the neighborhood seemed, was worth risking my daughter's safety. We stayed at my sister's for 2 weeks while I figured out what to do, eventually breaking my lease and finding a new place in a gated apartment complex with security and key fob access, somewhere Harold couldn't just wander by. I had to explain to Lily why we moved so suddenly, settling on a version of the truth that wouldn't terrify her, just that sometimes grown-ups don't make good choices about boundaries, and we needed to live somewhere with better rules. The property management company forwarded me mail for a while, mostly junk and bills, but one day there was a hand-addressed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photo, taken from a distance but clearly showing Lily on our old porch in those pink pajamas reaching for the newspaper. On the back, in spidery handwriting, it said, "Such a shame you had to leave." I took it straight to the police station, added it to the file, but nothing ever came of it. They increased patrols in the old neighborhood for a while, but Harold never did anything else they could arrest him for. 6 months later, I got a call from our old neighbor across the street, a woman named Beth who I'd only spoken to once or twice. She'd found my number through the property management company, wanted to let me know that Harold had been arrested. Not for anything involving children, but for breaking into another neighbor's house while they were on vacation, apparently looking for something, though nobody could figure out what. When they searched his house, They found boxes of photographs, hundreds of them, all of children from the neighborhood spanning back years, pictures taken from bushes, through windows, from his car. They found pictures of Lily, dozens of them, including ones from inside our house that he must have taken through windows when we weren't paying attention. Beth said the detective wanted my contact information, that they were building a bigger case now, connecting him to incidents in 3 different states. I hung up and held Lily extra tight that night, grateful for my instincts, for running when every logical part of me said I was overreacting. Harold got 15 years, not nearly enough, but at least he was finally behind bars where he couldn't watch anyone's daughter through their kitchen window, couldn't stand on sidewalks planning God knows what. After splashing cold water on my face, I checked on Lily, watching her sleep peacefully with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, completely unaware of the danger living 20 feet away. I pulled her bedroom curtains closed, making sure they overlapped completely, then went through the house doing the same with every window that faced Harold's property. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-husband asking about weekend plans, but I couldn't focus on anything except the old man next door and what I should do about him. Calling the police seemed pointless. What would I say? That my neighbor gave my daughter cookies and had some old allegations that never went anywhere. I knew how that would sound, like a hysterical single mother making drama out of nothing. But I also knew what I'd found, and more importantly, I knew that gut feeling I'd been ignoring, that primitive maternal instinct that had been screaming at me every time Harold looked at my daughter. The decision to keep Lily inside the next day led to the kind of tantrum only a 7-year-old denied her outdoor time could produce. She pressed her face against the living room window, whining about wanting to ride her bike, to play hopscotch, to do anything other than watch cartoons and color. Around noon, Harold knocked on our door, holding a plate covered in aluminum foil, his excuse being that he'd made too many brownies and thought we might enjoy them. Standing in my doorway, he peered past me into the house, his pale eyes searching, and asked if Lily was feeling all right since he hadn't seen her outside all morning. The casual way he tracked my daughter's routine made my skin prickle with revulsion, but I managed to keep my voice steady, telling him she had a cold, taking the plate with hands that wanted to slam the door in his face. He lingered on my porch for another minute, mentioning again that he'd be taking a trip soon, just overnight, and would really appreciate if Lily could check on Whiskers, even offered to pay her $5 for the help. The lease paperwork from 2016 still sits in my desk drawer, right next to the pepper spray my mom bought me when I signed it. I just finished my master's degree that May, and this studio apartment in Portland felt like the first real step into adulthood. The building was nothing special, just a converted warehouse from the 60s with thin walls and radiators that clanged like someone was beating them with a wrench, but the rent was manageable on my salary as a lab technician at the hospital. For the first 8 months, everything was perfect. I'd come home from my shifts, usually around 7 in the evening, kick off my scrubs, and enjoy the quiet sanctuary of my own space. The only neighbor I ever noticed was Mrs. Huang across the hall, who'd sometimes leave containers of dumplings outside my door when she made too many. Then Walter moved into the unit directly below mine. I remember that Tuesday in January because I was carrying groceries up the stairs when I saw him for the first time, standing in his doorway watching the movers haul in a leather recliner that looked like it belonged in a hunting lodge. He had this way of standing that made him seem larger than he actually was, shoulders rolled forward, arms crossed tight against his barrel chest. His hair was thinning on top but long in the back, greasy strands that touched his collar, and when he smiled at me, only half his mouth moved, like the other side was holding on to some private joke. I nodded politely, shifted my grocery bags to one arm to wave, and immediately regretted it when he took it as an invitation to introduce himself. His handshake was damp and he held on a beat too long, telling me how nice it was to finally meet a neighbor, how quiet the building seemed, how he hoped we'd be friends. The first complaint came 3 weeks later. I'd gotten home late from a double shift, around 11 at night, and was making myself a quick dinner when I heard the pounding on my door. Walter stood there in a stained undershirt and sweatpants, his face red and puffy like he'd been drinking. He said my footsteps were keeping him awake, that I walked like I was trying to stomp through the floor, and didn't I have any consideration for the people living below me? I apologized, genuinely confused because I'd been wearing socks and trying to move quietly. But he kept going, saying the microwave humming was like a drill in his skull, that even the water running through the pipes sounded like a waterfall in his bedroom. I promised to be more careful, and he left, but not before leaning in close enough that I could smell the beer and something else, something sour like milk left out too long. After that night, I became hyper-aware of every sound I made. I started taking my shoes off in the hallway, tiptoed everywhere like I was walking on glass, even stopped using my microwave after 9. But the complaints kept coming. He'd text me at all hours, long rambling messages about how I was doing it on purpose, how I was trying to drive him crazy, how women like me thought we were so much better than everyone else. I showed them to my friend Natalie, who works security at the hospital, and she told me to stop responding, to document everything, to call the landlord. But our landlord, Mr. Jameson, was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. He said neighbor disputes weren't his problem, that we needed to work it out like adults, and besides, Walter always paid his rent on time. The day I stopped responding to his texts was a Wednesday in March. I'd finally had enough after he sent me 17 messages in 2 hours while I was trying to sleep before a morning shift. I blocked his number, and for about 6 hours, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. But when I got home that evening, there was a note shoved under my door, written in pencil so hard it had torn through the paper in places. He called me names I won't repeat, said I was a stuck-up princess who needed to learn some respect, that ignoring him was the biggest mistake I'd ever make. The next morning, another note, this one longer, describing in detail all the ways he could hear me moving around, like he was keeping a log of my every step. He knew when I showered, when I cooked, when I watched TV, even when I rolled over in bed. That's when I stopped sleeping properly. I'd lie there in the dark, straining to hear any sound from below, wondering if he was awake too, listening to me breathe. I bought a white noise machine, but it made things worse because then I couldn't hear if someone was at my door. I started sleeping on my couch instead of my bed, thinking maybe he couldn't hear me as well from the living room. But the notes kept coming, each one angrier, more unhinged, accusing me of deliberately tormenting him with my existence. He'd slip them under the door at random times, and I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, like he wanted me to know he was there. Sometimes I'd find them when I left for work at 6 in the morning, meaning he'd been up all night writing them, or worse, waiting for the right moment to deliver them. I finally called the police on a Saturday afternoon after I found a note that made my stomach turn to ice. He'd written about how thin the floors were, how he could map out my apartment just by listening, how he knew exactly where my bed was positioned because he could hear the frame creak when I got in. The 2 officers who showed up looked bored before I even finished explaining. They said, unless he made a direct threat of violence, it was a civil matter. One of them, Officer Murphy, actually suggested I try being friendlier, maybe bake him some cookies, work things out neighbor to neighbor. They did knock on his door, but Walter didn't answer, and they shrugged and left. 20 minutes after their patrol car pulled away, I heard him laughing through the floor. This low, grinding sound that went on until I grabbed my keys and left, spending the night at Natalie's place. The tapping started the following Monday night. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe a mouse in the walls, just this soft, rhythmic sound coming from somewhere near my bedroom. But it was too regular, too deliberate, tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 like someone knocking politely on a door. I followed the sound, pressing my ear to different spots on the floor until I realized it was coming from directly under my bed. My apartment had hardwood floors with a few area rugs, and when I got down on my stomach with my phone flashlight, I could see between the old floorboards and spots. The tapping stopped the second I got close, like whatever was making it could sense me there. I stayed frozen on my bedroom floor for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing, waiting, and then it started again, this time more insistent, almost playful. I convinced myself it had to be the heating system or maybe Walter banging on his ceiling with a broom handle to mess with me. But deep down, something felt wrong about how precisely located the sound was, always right under wherever I happened to be in the bedroom. I started avoiding the room entirely, grabbing my clothes for the next day and changing in the bathroom, sleeping on the couch permanently. But 2 nights later, the tapping followed me. First under the couch, then under the kitchen table when I sat there with my laptop, then under the bathroom when I tried to take a shower. It was like he had a map of my apartment and was following my every move from below, announcing his presence with those soft, maddening taps. I called Natalie, begging her to come over and listen, to tell me I wasn't going insane. But by the time she arrived, the tapping had stopped completely. That's when I remembered something the building superintendent had mentioned when I first moved in, something about maintenance access panels in each unit for the plumbing and electrical work. He'd pointed to a painted-over square in my bedroom closet floor, said it connected to a crawl space that ran between the floors, told me never to open it because it was full of asbestos or lead paint or some other hazard that would cost the owner too much to fix properly. I'd forgotten about it completely until that moment, standing in my living room with Natalie, both of us listening to the silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We went to my bedroom closet, pushed aside the boxes of winter clothes and old textbooks, and there it was, that square outline in the floor, except the paint around the edges was cracked now, little white flakes scattered on the dark wood like snow, and one corner of the panel was slightly raised, just enough that you could see the black gap underneath if you looked at the right angle. Natalie grabbed a screwdriver from my kitchen drawer and we pried the panel up together, our phone's lights aimed down into the darkness. The crawl space was maybe 3 feet high, filled with pipes and wiring and decades of dust, but there were clear drag marks in the dirt, fresh ones leading from the direction of Walter's apartment to directly under my bedroom. And there, caught on a nail, was a piece of fabric from what looked like the same stained undershirt he'd worn that first night he complained. We could see where he'd cleared a path, pushed aside insulation, even set up what looked like a foam pad right under where my bed would be. Natalie was already calling 911 while I stood there, staring at a notebook he'd left behind, filled with pages and pages of times and descriptions, every sound I'd made for weeks, noting when I cried, when I talked on the phone, when I breathed too heavily. The last entry from just hours before simply said, "Tonight she'll finally understand we belong together." The police found Walter in the crawl space when they arrived, curled up on that foam pad directly under my bed, with a battery-powered lantern and a thermos of coffee like he was camping. He didn't resist when they dragged him out through his own apartment's access panel, just kept saying I'd invited him, that the way I walked was a code, that my footsteps had been spelling out messages only he could understand. They arrested him for breaking and entering, stalking and criminal trespass. And at the trial 4 months later, his lawyer tried to argue mental illness, but the notebook showed too much planning, too much careful calculation. He got 18 months in prison and a restraining order that might as well be toilet paper, for all the good it would do if he decided to come back. I moved out the next day, stayed with Natalie until I found a new place, a 3rd-floor apartment in a building with proper security and no crawl spaces. Sometimes at night, when the upstairs neighbors walk around, I still find myself holding my breath, listening for that soft tapping, waiting for it to follow me to my new home. Finding a place we could actually afford felt impossible until we stumbled across that duplex listing in early April. My girlfriend Ashley and I had been sharing a cramped studio since she finished her nursing degree, and we were desperate for space where we wouldn't trip over each other constantly. At 29, I was finally making decent money as a tax preparer, enough that splitting rent on a 2-bedroom didn't seem like financial suicide anymore. Ashley worked rotating shifts at the hospital, 12 hours that left her exhausted, but paid well enough to cover her student loans and still have something left over. We toured the place on a Saturday morning, and within an hour we were signing papers with the landlord, an older guy named Frank, who kept emphasizing how quiet the neighborhood was. He mentioned our neighbor would be sharing the other half of the duplex, some guy named Douglas who'd been there for years and never caused any problems. Moving day came 2 weeks later, and we spent that entire weekend arranging furniture and arguing about where to hang pictures. Ashley had this collection of framed botanical prints from her grandmother that she wanted everywhere, while I just wanted somewhere to put my gaming setup without getting lectured about the mess of cables. We could hear our neighbor through the shared wall, especially at night when everything else got quiet. Footsteps creaking on floorboards, moving from room to room in patterns that seemed almost mechanical, like he was following the same path over and over. His television stayed on constantly, that pale flickering light visible through our bedroom blinds at 3, 4, 5 in the morning. Ashley said maybe he had trouble sleeping, or worked from home on some weird schedule. We figured everyone had their quirks, and at least he wasn't throwing parties or playing drums. About 3 weeks after moving in, we finally saw Douglas for the first time. I was hauling garbage bags to the curb on a Wednesday evening when he emerged from his side door carrying his own trash. He moved in this careful, deliberate way, like someone recovering from surgery or afraid of pulling a muscle. Mid-40s maybe, wearing a faded polo shirt and khakis that looked like they'd been washed 100 times. His hair was combed straight back with so much gel it looked wet, and he had these thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an uncomfortable size. When he noticed me, he stopped mid-step and just stared for a moment before offering this tight nod. I said hey, introduced myself, mentioned we'd just moved in. He kept nodding while I talked, his mouth slightly open like he was about to respond but couldn't quite form the words. Finally, he muttered something about keeping the noise down after 10 and hurried back inside. Ashley thought I was being dramatic when I told her the interaction made me uncomfortable. She reminded me that plenty of people were awkward or antisocial, and that didn't make them creepy. Still, I started paying more attention to the sounds from next door. The pacing happened every single night without fail, usually starting around 11:15 and continuing until at least 2 in the morning. Sometimes I'd lie awake listening, trying to map out his path through the rooms, kitchen to living room, down the hallway, pause for exactly 30 seconds, then back again. The strangest part was how consistent the timing was, like he was counting steps or following some internal metronome. During the day, we'd hear him occasionally, usually the muffled sound of his television or the microwave beeping. But those nighttime walks were constant, predictable as clockwork. One night in late May, Ashley was working a double shift and wouldn't be home until morning. I'd been trying to sleep, but the pacing seemed louder than usual, more aggressive somehow. Each footstep landed harder, and I could hear him mumbling to himself between circuits. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out words, but it was just this low, continuous stream of syllables that didn't form anything coherent. Then the pacing stopped abruptly, right in the middle of his usual route. Complete silence for maybe 5 minutes. I was just starting to relax when I heard a different sound, a soft scraping coming from inside our apartment. I sat up in bed, heart hammering, listening hard. The scraping continued for another minute or so, like metal against wood, then stopped. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed and searched the entire apartment, checking locks, peering into closets. Everything looked normal, nothing out of place. Ashley got home around 7 that morning, exhausted and ready to crash. I tried explaining what had happened, but she was too tired to really process it. Said we'd talk after she got some sleep. While she was in the shower, I decided to do another check of the apartment in daylight. That's when I went into our bedroom closet to grab a clean shirt for work. As I pushed aside the hanging clothes, I noticed something odd about the back wall. There was a small pile of white dust on the floor, like drywall powder. I looked up and found it, about eye level, partially hidden behind Ashley's winter coats. A hole, perfectly round, maybe the width of a pencil. I leaned closer and could see straight through into darkness. My whole body went cold as I realized what this meant. The hole went through our wall directly into Douglas's apartment, positioned at the exact height where someone standing on the other side could look through. I backed out of the closet, legs shaking, trying to process what I'd discovered. How long had that hole been there? Had it existed before we moved in, or had Douglas drilled it recently? The scraping sound from last night suddenly made horrible sense. I thought about all the nights Ashley and I had been in that bedroom, getting dressed, sleeping, being intimate, completely unaware that we might have had an audience. My stomach churned as I remembered how the closet door usually stayed open because the track was broken and it would slide open on its own. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of the hole, the drywall dust, everything. When Ashley came out of the shower, I showed her immediately. The color drained from her face as she understood what she was looking at. She kept saying, "No, no, no," like repetition could make it untrue. We stood there in our bedroom, both of us scanning the walls, wondering if there were other holes we hadn't found yet. Ashley wanted to call the police right away, but I convinced her we should check the rest of the apartment first, document everything properly. We spent the next hour going over every inch of our walls, especially the ones we shared with Douglas. We found 2 more holes, one in the bathroom behind the toilet, another in the living room concealed behind a bookshelf we'd pushed against the wall. Each one was the same size, drilled with precision, angled slightly downward like whoever made them had been standing while looking through. The bathroom one was the worst because it had a clear view of the shower. Ashley started crying when she saw it, realizing how exposed we'd been. I felt rage building in my chest, this hot, violent feeling I'd never experienced before. This man had been watching us, violating our privacy in the most intimate moments of our lives. The pacing at night took on a whole new meaning now. Was he walking from hole to hole, checking on us like we were animals in a zoo? We called the police around 9 that morning. 2 officers showed up within 20 minutes, a younger guy who looked fresh out of training, and an older woman who'd clearly seen everything in her years on the job. They took our report, examined the holes, took their own photos. The older officer, Sergeant Martinez, asked if we'd noticed anything missing, or if Douglas had ever tried to make contact beyond that one encounter by the garbage. We told her about the pacing, the constant television, how he'd been doing this routine every single night. She nodded like she'd heard similar stories before, which somehow made it worse. They went next door to talk to Douglas, but he didn't answer. His car was in the driveway, that beige sedan that looked like it hadn't been washed in years, but no amount of knocking got a response. Sergeant Martinez said they'd need a warrant to enter without probable cause of immediate danger, but they could start the paperwork based on what we'd shown them. Frank, our landlord, arrived about an hour after the police left. He looked genuinely shocked when we showed him the holes, kept apologizing and saying Douglas had been there for 8 years without a single complaint. He authorized us to break our lease immediately, no penalties, and said he'd return our full deposit that day. He also mentioned something that made my skin prickle. The previous tenants, a young married couple, had broken their lease after only 2 months. They'd been vague about why, just said the place wasn't working out. Frank hadn't pushed for details because they'd paid a penalty to leave early. Now he wondered if they'd discovered the same thing we had, but hadn't wanted to deal with the embarrassment or legal hassle of reporting it. While Frank was talking, I noticed movement in Douglas's window. Just a quick shift of the curtains. He was in there, watching us deal with the aftermath of his sick hobby. We stayed in a motel that night. Neither of us could stand the thought of sleeping in that apartment knowing what we knew. Ashley barely spoke during the drive there, just stared out the window with her arms wrapped around herself. I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that Douglas might be following us, but there was no beige sedan trailing behind. The motel room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning products, but it felt safer than our own home. We ordered pizza, but neither of us could eat more than a few bites. Ashley finally broke down completely, sobbing about how violated she felt, how she kept imagining him watching her in the shower, getting dressed, all those private moments that were supposed to be just hers. I held her while she cried, feeling helpless and furious at the same time. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Sergeant Martinez. She told me they'd gotten their warrant and entered Douglas's apartment that afternoon. What they found was worse than we'd imagined. His living room wall, the one he shared with us, had been turned into some kind of observation station. He'd mounted small monitors connected to tiny cameras he'd threaded through the holes, recording equipment, notebooks filled with detailed logs of our daily routines. The dates went back months before we'd even moved in, documenting the previous tenants' every move. But that wasn't the worst part. They'd found external hard drives containing hundreds of hours of footage, not just of us, but of at least 6 other couples who'd lived in that unit over the years. Douglas had been doing this for nearly a decade, perfecting his sick surveillance system with each new tenant. They'd arrested him on multiple charges, including voyeurism, stalking, and criminal trespass. He hadn't said a word during the arrest, just stared at the officers with that same blank expression I'd seen by the garbage bins. The prosecutor contacted us a few days later to discuss the case. She explained that Douglas would likely take a plea deal to avoid trial, which meant we wouldn't have to testify, but also meant he'd probably serve less time. The thought of him getting out in just a few years made me sick, but Ashley couldn't handle the idea of sitting in a courtroom describing what he'd done to us. We agreed to the plea deal. Douglas got 5 years with possibility of parole in 3, plus lifetime registration as a sex offender. It didn't feel like enough, not even close, but at least he couldn't do this to anyone else for a while. The prosecutor mentioned that they'd managed to identify and contact most of his previous victims. Some of them had noticed strange things but never put it together. Others had no idea they'd been watched for months. One couple had divorced shortly after moving out. The stress of feeling unsafe in their own home had destroyed their relationship, even though they never knew the real reason for their discomfort. Ashley and I found a new apartment on the other side of town, a 3rd-floor unit in a building with proper security and no shared walls. We had a contractor check every inch of it before we moved in, looking for any signs of tampering or hidden cameras. Even now, 6 months later, I still check the walls obsessively, running my fingers along them searching for holes that aren't there. Ashley started seeing a therapist to deal with the trauma, and some days are better than others. She still can't shower without checking behind the shower curtain multiple times, and she changes clothes in the dark most nights. We're working through it together, but we're different people now, more guarded, less trusting. Sometimes I wake up at 11:15 and listen for footsteps that never come, my body still trained to Douglas's schedule. I know he's locked up, I know we're safe, but that knowledge doesn't stop the feeling that somewhere, somehow, we're still being watched. The detective told me they never figured out why Douglas did it. He never offered any explanation, never showed any remorse. Some people are just broken in ways we'll never understand, she said, and all we can do is try to protect ourselves from them. I think about that a lot, about how evil can live right next door, separated by nothing more than a thin wall and a few inches of insulation, pacing back and forth in the dark, watching, always watching. My divorce lawyer's business card was still sitting on my kitchen counter when I heard the moving truck rumble up next door on a humid Wednesday morning. 6 months of staring at that empty house through my home office window had made me paranoid about every little sound at night, so seeing actual people carrying furniture inside felt like winning a small lottery. I grabbed a 6-pack of beer from my fridge and walked over around noon, figuring it was the neighborly thing to do. Michael Anderson answered the door with paint smeared on his forearm, his wife Laura behind him unwrapping dishes from newspaper, and their teenage son Justin hauling boxes marked garage up from the basement. Medical equipment sales, elementary school teacher, high school junior. They laid out their life stories between sips of beer while we sat on their still plastic-wrapped couch. Laura kept apologizing for the mess while Michael told me about their last place in Michigan, how they'd needed a fresh start after some family drama with Laura's parents. Justin barely looked up from his phone except to ask if I knew any good spots to skateboard, which I didn't, but I appreciated him trying to engage with the old guy next door who was probably his dad's age, class of '05, making me feel every one of those years since graduation. Everything about them screamed normal suburban family for those first few weeks. Michael washing his SUV every Sunday morning, Laura planting marigolds along their front walk, Justin shooting hoops in their driveway after school. I work from home doing technical writing for a software company, basically translating engineer speak into human language, so I had a front row seat to their daily routines from my desk. October rolled in with early frost warnings, and I was actually sleeping well for the first time since signing those papers that split everything down the middle. Until that Saturday night, when metal scraping against dirt pulled me out of a dead sleep at 2:30 in the morning. My bedroom faces their backyard, and through the gap in my curtains I could make out this yellowish light, like from those portable work lamps contractors use. That steady, rhythmic digging sound kept going. Shk thud, methodical and purposeful. I lay there for 20 minutes trying to convince myself they were just putting in fence posts or planting a tree. But who does yard work at 2 in the morning, and why would they need to dig for over an hour straight without stopping? Sunday morning came and I expected to see fresh soil or some new garden feature in their yard. But when I casually walked along our shared fence line pretending to check my gutters, everything looked exactly the same. Michael was out there hosing down his SUV like always, whistling some tune I didn't recognize, and he gave me his usual wave with the chamois cloth in his hand. I asked him if he'd heard any raccoons last night, fishing for some explanation, and he just laughed and said they'd all been dead asleep by 9 o'clock. Laura came out with coffee for him, wearing these fuzzy slippers shaped like bear paws, and invited me over for dinner later that week. Standing there in the bright morning sun, watching them be so perfectly ordinary, I started doubting what I'd heard, wondering if maybe the sound had come from somewhere else entirely, or if those sleeping pills my doctor prescribed were messing with my head more than I realized. But then it happened again the following Friday, and this time I was ready. I'd been lying in bed since 11, lights off but wide awake, when that same scraping started at exactly 3 in the morning. This time I didn't stay in bed. I crept to my spare bedroom, which had a better angle of their backyard, and peeked through the blinds. There was Justin, illuminated by one of those camping headlamps, dragging what looked like a heavy contractor bag across their lawn toward the shed they'd installed the week before. The kid was stronger than he looked, managing that bag with steady determination, even though it seemed to weigh nearly as much as he did. Michael stood by the shed door holding it open, and when Justin got close enough, they both lifted the bag together and disappeared inside. 5 minutes later, they came out empty-handed, and Michael put his hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him back toward the house while Justin kept wiping his hands on his jeans over and over again. I couldn't focus on work after that, spending my days staring at their backyard from my office window, watching for any sign of what they might be hiding in that shed. During a conference call about API documentation, I watched Laura hanging laundry on their clothesline, humming and acting like she didn't have a care in the world. Justin would get home from school around 3:30, drop his backpack on the porch, and shoot baskets until dinner, never once going near the shed during daylight hours. Michael started working on some project in their garage with the door open, sawing and hammering away at what looked like shelving units, occasionally calling Justin over to hold a board steady. They were playing the part of the perfect family so well that I began to question my own sanity. wondering if stress from the divorce had finally pushed me into some kind of paranoid breakdown. My ex-wife had always said I overthought everything, turned molehills into mountains, and maybe she'd been right all along. I decided to test them, to see if I could get any kind of reaction that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. That Wednesday, when Laura invited me for dinner, I accepted, showing up with a bottle of wine and my best attempt at normal conversation. Their house smelled like pot roast and fresh bread, with family photos covering every surface. Justin, at various ages, always with that same crooked smile. Michael and Laura on vacation somewhere tropical, everyone looking genuinely happy. We ate at their dining room table while Justin talked about his history project on the Cold War, and Michael shared stories from his sales trips to rural hospitals. When I mentioned casually that I'd been having trouble sleeping lately, hearing strange noises at night, Laura's fork paused halfway to her mouth for just a second before she suggested I try chamomile tea. Michael jumped in immediately, talking about how the neighborhood had tons of wildlife, possums, raccoons, even a fox family that lived in the woods behind our street. Justin stayed quiet, pushing green beans around his plate, until his father asked him about basketball tryouts, and he launched into an enthusiastic recap of practice. After dinner, Michael offered to show me the shelving he'd been building in the garage, and I followed him out through their kitchen door, noticing how Laura's smile tightened when he suggested it. The garage was meticulously organized, tools hanging on pegboard in order of size, lumber stacked against the far wall with labels indicating length and type. Michael ran his hand along one of the shelves he'd finished, explaining his process for getting the joints perfectly flush, but I kept glancing toward the backyard, toward that shed sitting in the corner of their property like a secret wrapped in aluminum siding. I asked him what they kept in there, trying to sound casual, just making conversation, and he didn't miss a beat. Lawn equipment, holiday decorations, the usual suburban overflow that doesn't fit in the garage. He even offered to show me. Started walking toward the door, but then Laura called from inside that Justin needed help with his math homework, and Michael apologized, said we'd have to do the tour another time. I went home that night more convinced than ever that they were hiding something, and I made a decision that I'm not proud of, but couldn't stop myself from following through on. I ordered one of those wildlife cameras online, the kind hunters use, with night vision and motion activation. When it arrived 2 days later, I spent an afternoon pretending to trim the bushes along our fence line while I mounted it to a tree that had a clear view of their shed. The camera was smaller than I expected, olive green plastic that blended into the bark, and I angled it just right to capture anyone approaching from their house. That first night I barely slept, checking my phone every hour for motion alerts, but nothing triggered it except a cat around midnight and what looked like a possum just before dawn. Friday came and went with no activity, Saturday too, and I started to wonder if they'd somehow noticed the camera, if they were waiting me out, playing some kind of psychological game where they knew I was watching and wanted to see how long I'd keep it up. Monday night changed everything, and I wish to God I'd never installed that camera, never looked at what it captured. The alert came through at 2:47 a.m., and when I opened the app on my phone, the infrared image showed all three of them in their backyard. But this time they weren't heading to the shed. They were standing in a circle on their lawn, each holding what looked like a small gardening trowel, and they were digging, but not in one spot. They were making a pattern, connected holes about the size of coffee cans, maybe a dozen of them arranged in some kind of shape I couldn't quite make out from the camera angle. Laura was wearing a bathrobe over pajamas, her hair tied back with what looked like a bandana, and she kept checking something on her phone, like she was following instructions or keeping track of time. Michael had on sweatpants and a hoodie, moving between the holes and measuring distances with a tape measure, making sure everything was precise. Justin looked exhausted, rubbing his eyes between digging sessions, but his parents kept him moving, Laura touching his shoulder whenever he slowed down, not roughly but insistent, like this was something that absolutely had to be finished before sunrise. Then they started bringing things out from the shed, and my mouth went completely dry watching them work with such practiced efficiency. First came small cloth bags, the kind banks use for coins, each one tied with colored string, red, blue, yellow, green, and they placed one bag in each hole with careful deliberation. Michael went back to the shed and returned with what looked like mason jars filled with dark liquid, and they poured a small amount from each jar onto the bags, the liquid soaking into the soil. The smell must have been strong because even Justin pulled his shirt up over his nose, and Laura turned her face away each time she poured. They worked in complete silence except for the occasional whispered instruction from Michael, and I realized they'd done this before, many times, because everyone knew exactly what their role was, when to move, where to stand. After the liquid came white powder from a plastic container, sprinkled over each hole like they were seasoning food. And then finally they began covering everything with dirt, patting it down flat, making the lawn look undisturbed. I sat there staring at my phone screen until the battery died, trying to process what I'd witnessed, and when I finally got up to plug it in, I noticed movement outside my window. Michael was standing at the fence line between our properties, just standing there in the darkness, facing my house. I couldn't see his expression, couldn't tell if he was looking at my window specifically or just staring at the house in general. But he stood there for what must have been 5 full minutes before turning and walking back to his house. The next morning I called in sick to work. Couldn't imagine trying to write documentation while knowing what my neighbors had buried in their yard. Around 10 o'clock, Laura knocked on my door with a plate of fresh muffins, blueberry with a crumb topping, and her smile was so warm, so genuine, that for a moment I almost convinced myself I'd dreamed the whole thing. She asked if I was feeling all right, said Michael mentioned seeing my lights on late last night, wondered if my insomnia was getting worse. I took the muffins, thanked her, told her I was fine, just work stress, and she patted my arm like a concerned mother before heading back to her house. That afternoon I couldn't stand it anymore and decided to check the fence line where I'd installed the camera, telling myself I was just making sure it was still hidden. But when I got to the tree, the camera was gone. Not damaged, not hanging loose, just gone, like it had never been there at all, and the only evidence it had existed was a small indentation in the bark where I'd secured the strap. I stood there running my fingers over that mark, and when I turned around, Justin was standing about 10 feet away, holding a basketball, just watching me. He didn't say anything at first, just bounced the ball once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp in the quiet afternoon, and then he asked if I'd lost something, if I needed help looking for it. I told him no, just checking for damage from the storm we'd had last week, even though there hadn't been any storm, and he nodded slowly, said his dad was good with tree stuff if I needed help, then walked back to his driveway and continued shooting hoops like nothing had happened. That night I lay in bed with every door locked, chair wedged under the doorknob of my bedroom door, telling myself I was being ridiculous but unable to shake the feeling that they were done playing games with me. Around midnight I heard footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate, followed by a gentle knock. Not urgent or aggressive, just 3 soft taps like someone dropping by to borrow sugar. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there listening as the knocking came again. Same pattern, same politeness. And then I heard Michael's voice, calm and friendly, asking if I was awake, saying he had something to show me in the shed, something that would explain everything. He waited maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard his footsteps moving away, down my porch steps, and the night went quiet again. I stayed frozen in that bed until sunrise, and when I finally worked up the courage to check my front door, there was a single manila envelope tucked into the frame. No name, no address, just sitting there waiting for me. Inside the envelope were photographs, dozens of them, all taken from angles that showed my house, my bedroom window, my home office, my backyard, even one through my kitchen window showing me making coffee. But the dates on the photos, the little timestamps in the corner, they were all from before the Andersons moved in, some going back months when the house was supposedly empty. The last photo in the stack showed me installing the camera on the tree, taken from behind, so close I could see the sweat stain on my shirt collar. On the back, someone had written in neat blue ink, "We were here first. We were always here. Stop looking or we'll have to stop being neighbors." I packed a bag that morning, threw it in my car along with my laptop and whatever clothes I could grab in 5 minutes, and drove to a motel 3 towns over. I called a real estate agent from the motel room, told them to list my house immediately, take whatever offer came first. I didn't care about the money anymore. The house sold in 2 weeks to a cash buyer who waived inspection, which should have been my first red flag, but I was too relieved to care. I signed the papers electronically, never went back to collect the rest of my things, just had a moving company pack everything up and put it in storage. Started over in a different state, got a small apartment near downtown where there were always people around, always lights and noise and activity. For months I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, heart racing, waiting to hear that scraping sound, but it never came. Slowly I started to convince myself that maybe I'd misunderstood everything. Maybe they were just eccentric people with weird hobbies. Maybe the photos had been taken by a previous owner or some real estate company doing market research. Then about a year later, I was mindlessly scrolling through news articles when I saw it. A story about human remains being discovered in Pine Valley Road during construction of a new development. The house next to mine had been demolished, and when they started excavating for the foundation, they found bones, lots of them, some dating back decades. The article mentioned that the previous owners, a family of 3, had disappeared without a trace, leaving no forwarding address, no trail to follow. I still think about the Andersons sometimes, usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and the room is too quiet. I wonder if they're out there somewhere, living next to someone else now, washing their car on Sunday mornings, bringing over casseroles, burying things in patterns under cover of darkness. I changed my name after I moved, deleted all my social media, got a new phone number, did everything I could to disappear, but sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like Michael at the grocery store, or hear a laugh that sounds like Laura's, or see a teenager bouncing a basketball with that same steady rhythm. Once, twice, 3 times. And I know it's not them. It can't be them, they don't know where I am. But I still leave the store immediately, still drive a different route home, still check my locks twice before bed. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't what they were burying or why they were doing it. It's that note, those 5 words that made everything clear. We were always here. They weren't the new neighbors moving in next to me. I was the one who'd moved in next to them. And whatever they were doing, whatever they were hiding, I'd gotten too close to something that was never meant to be found. There was a time when quiet meant safety to me. My house sat at the very end of a small cul-de-sac, surrounded by elm trees that rustled even when there was no wind. The neighborhood had a strange kind of calm, the kind that made every sound stand out, like a door creak or the distant bark of a dog. I'd moved there for peace after a long and messy breakup, and my days were a mix of remote work, long walks, and late nights reading by the kitchen window. I barely knew anyone until the old man next door, Mr. Henry Lawson, started showing up with a basket of muffins or pie every few days. He had that gentle, old-fashioned politeness that made me think of another era. Henry lived alone in the house across the street, the one with the ivy crawling up the porch rails and the heavy green shutters. He liked to talk about how the cul-de-sac used to be full of families, how the kids ran through the sprinklers right there, pointing at the patch of grass between our driveways. His stories were warm at first, and I liked listening. He would smile, his eyes almost hidden behind thick glasses, and talk about good neighbors, good times. But after a while, I started noticing how he always seemed to glance toward his basement door, as if making sure it was still closed every time I visited. The first odd thing happened one night in early autumn. I was closing my kitchen window when I heard a metallic clang, followed by a dull thud that seemed to come from Henry's house. It was late, nearly midnight, and the sound was so distinct that I turned off the lights just to listen. There it was again, like something heavy being dragged on concrete. I told myself maybe he was moving furniture or storing tools. But when I looked out, I saw a faint yellow light flickering through the narrow basement window on his side of the house. It went out seconds later, leaving the yard in complete darkness. The next day, I brought up the noise casually. Henry chuckled and said he had been fixing his furnace. His tone was friendly, but something about the way he tightened his grip on the pie plate caught my attention. He thanked me for checking in, then quickly changed the subject, asking if I liked pecan or apple better. I noticed his hands were rough, like someone who still did heavy work despite his age. When he walked me to the door, he locked it right after I stepped out. I heard the click before I even reached the gate. At the time, I laughed it off as an old man's habit. But that sound of the lock turning stayed in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. Few evenings later, I was walking back from the mailbox when I saw Henry outside, kneeling beside his garden shed. He was digging into the soil, carefully piling dirt into a wheelbarrow. When he noticed me, he smiled and waved, but there was something odd about how quickly he covered the hole with a tarp. I asked if he needed help, and he said it was just old pipes, his voice softer than usual. Behind him, the basement door stood wide open for the first time, and I caught a glimpse of stairs leading down into dim light. A chill went through me, not fear exactly, but a sense that I had stepped too close to something private. Later that night, it started again. Scraping, slow and rhythmic, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I pressed my ear against the wall that faced his house and waited. For a moment, there was nothing, and then 3 sharp knocks echoed through the quiet like someone hitting metal. I nearly called the police, but stopped myself. How would that sound? My neighbor's basement is making noises? It felt ridiculous. So I sat there, lights off, watching that same narrow basement window glow faintly again. The light swayed as if someone was walking with a lantern. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. The next afternoon, I made a reason to visit, returning his pie dish. He invited me in, cheerful as always, and I immediately noticed how cold the house was. It smelled faintly of bleach and old paper. We talked in the kitchen for a while until he excused himself to check something downstairs. I waited until I heard the lock click behind him before stepping quietly toward the hallway. The basement door was heavy, reinforced with a thick padlock that looked newer than the rest of the house. Beside the door, an old framed photograph caught my attention. Several people standing on the same street, all smiling. I recognized none of them except Henry, decades younger, standing right where my house would be built years later. That night, I searched for the street name online, just out of curiosity. What I found made my heart pound. A few old newspaper scans mentioned disappearances from this exact block, 3 different people, spread over 20 years. The reports were vague, mentioning no signs of forced entry, and residents last seen near the end of the cul-de-sac. In 2 of the articles, the name Henry Lawson appeared as a witness who reported unusual noises, or was among the last to see the missing person. I stared at his picture in the article. The same calm expression, the same faint smile. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the more I read, the harder that became. The next morning, I saw him standing in his yard, trimming the hedges like any other day. The normalcy of it unsettled me. I could not stop thinking about those articles. I printed them out and kept them on my table, reading and rereading the lines that mentioned his name. At one point, I glanced out the window and realized he was watching me. Not directly. His head was tilted just enough that I could see the reflection of my house in his glasses. When our eyes finally met, he smiled and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. That night, the noises started again, louder than before. Around 3 in the morning, I called the police. I told them there was a disturbance next door and that I believed someone might be hurt. They came within 20 minutes, 2 officers walking up his driveway with flashlights. I watched from my window as Henry opened the door in his robe, calm as ever. They talked for a few minutes. Then one of the officers laughed at something he said. After a short look around the backyard, they left. Henry stood there for a while after they were gone, just staring at my window before slowly going back inside. The next day, a pie tin sat on my porch filled with cookies and a small note that read, "No hard feelings, neighbor." I barely slept that week. I packed a small bag and decided to stay with a friend across town for a few days. But before leaving, I felt compelled to check something. The old police reports had mentioned a storm drain that connected several properties on our street, one entrance behind Henry's shed. I went out early that morning and walked around to the back of his fence. The air smelled damp, metallic. I found the drain partially hidden by vines and crouched down. Inside, barely visible in the dark, was the glint of a chain and something else. Fabric, pale and torn. I stepped back so fast I nearly fell, my heartbeat filling my ears. I moved out 2 weeks later. The house sold quicker than I expected, and I never went back to that neighborhood. I did call the police again, anonymously this time, and told them about the drain. Whether they ever looked into it, I will never know. Every now and then I search Henry Lawson's name online. Nothing new ever comes up. But sometimes when the nights are too quiet, I catch myself listening, waiting for that faint metallic sound that used to echo from his basement, the one that told me I was never really alone on that street. It started with something small, a cracked fence post between my yard and the man next door. I remembered noticing it after a storm that had torn through the area overnight. The wooden panels leaned slightly toward my side, and when I mentioned it to him, he said it was probably my fault for letting my shrubs grow too close. His name was Howard, a retired mechanic who spent most of his days sitting on his porch with a can of beer. We weren't friends, but I had always tried to be polite. Until that day, we had never exchanged more than a few neighborly words. At first, I figured our little argument would blow over. People get touchy about property lines. I offered to split the cost of repairs, but he just walked away mid-sentence, muttering something I couldn't catch. A week later, I noticed he'd parked his old truck in a way that blocked part of my driveway. The next morning, there were dead potted plants tossed onto my lawn, their roots exposed, soil scattered like ashes. I didn't have proof it was him, but who else would do something like that? Things kept escalating in quiet, unsettling ways. The motion light above my garage started flickering every night, always around the same hour. I replaced the bulb, checked the wiring. It wasn't that. One evening, I caught him standing on his porch, staring straight at my kitchen window while I washed dishes. He didn't look away, didn't move, just stood there with this blank expression, his beer can resting against the railing. It wasn't rage on his face or even amusement. It was emptiness, like he was waiting for something. That's when I decided to call the city and report him for harassment and illegal dumping. I didn't want to, but I was tired of feeling watched. The officer I spoke to said they'd send someone by to talk to him. For a couple of days, things were quiet. Then one night, the power went out across the whole block. I thought it was just another outage, until I saw a faint shape near the fence line, standing perfectly still, right inside my backyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The moonlight barely reached the backyard, but I could see enough to make out the outline of someone near the fence. I stood still by the window, hoping maybe it was a tree or a shadow from a neighbor's yard. Then it moved, slowly, deliberately, closer to the house. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. I didn't grab my phone right away because I didn't want to draw attention with the light. I just stayed there, watching, trying to convince myself it wasn't what it looked like. The figure stepped under the porch light, and even though the power was out, there was just enough glow from a nearby street lamp to see the jacket. It was Howard's. That same faded denim jacket he wore every day, the one with oil stains on the sleeves. He wasn't holding a flashlight. He wasn't holding anything. He was just standing there, facing the back door like he was waiting for it to open. I crouched down behind the counter, clutching my house keys so tightly they left marks in my hand. After what felt like forever, he turned toward the side gate. I heard the latch rattle, but it didn't open. I realized I had locked it earlier that evening. Thank God. Then came the sound of footsteps circling the side of the house, slow and dragging. My dog, Benny, started whining from under the table. He never barked, just whimpered, like he knew we weren't supposed to make a sound. I stayed crouched there, counting the seconds between each step until everything went silent again. Minutes later, the hum of the refrigerator kicked back in. The power had returned. The light flickered on, and I ran to the front window to see if he was still outside. The porch was empty. His truck was gone. But something caught my eye near the curb. A trail of wet footprints leading from my backyard to the street, faint but visible under the lamplight. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound felt sharper, every creak louder, and I kept picturing that jacket in the dark. The next morning I went outside and found that part of the fence had been pushed inward again, this time splintered at the base. A muddy boot print sat right beside it. I took photos and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the prints had mostly dried, and they said there wasn't enough to go on. One of the officers knocked on Howard's door, but no one answered. His truck wasn't there either. They told me to call if he came back, though they didn't sound convinced it was serious. Maybe they deal with too many neighbor disputes to see when one is different. Over the next few days, I barely left the house. Every creak from the porch made me tense up. I started keeping a flashlight and a kitchen knife near the bed, just in case. Then, one afternoon, a city inspector came by to confirm the harassment complaint I had filed. He said Howard had been issued a warning notice but hadn't been seen at his address since. Apparently the house belonged to his brother, who told them Howard had moved out suddenly and left most of his belongings behind. I asked if that included his truck. The inspector said no. There was no truck in the driveway when they went by. For a while, things actually went quiet. The lights stayed steady, the fence untouched. I even started sleeping better. But about 2 weeks later, a small brown package showed up on my doorstep. No return address, no label. Inside was a single photo, printed on cheap glossy paper. It was a picture of my backyard, taken from outside the fence in the dark. The back door was open, and I was standing in the kitchen facing away from the camera. I called the police again, but they couldn't trace where the package came from. They suggested maybe it was a prank, and that I should install security cameras. I did. For months, nothing happened. No one appeared, no more packages. Still, every time the power flickers or the motion light clicks on, I find myself staring through that same window, expecting to see a figure in a denim jacket standing by the fence, waiting for me to step outside. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. April had just turned cold again when I got the call about the house. My childhood home in Millbridge, Vermont, had been sitting empty for 18 months since Dad passed, and the lawyer said it was time to either sell or commit to the property taxes. I'd been avoiding it, honestly. The place held too many memories, and not all of them were the kind you want to revisit. But my apartment lease in Boston was ending, and I figured 2 weeks in Vermont wouldn't kill me. I could sort through decades of accumulated stuff, get the house ready for listing, and maybe find some closure. The drive up through New Hampshire felt longer than I remembered. The mountains pressing in on both sides of the highway, still patched with dirty snow even though it was late March. Millbridge hadn't changed much. Population 3,200, one stoplight, 3 churches and a general store that doubled as the post office. The kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do. The house looked smaller than it did in my memories. The white paint had gone gray in patches, and the apple orchard behind the property had grown wild, branches tangled together like arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. Dad had stopped maintaining it after Mom died in 2009. I'd been away at college then, and when I came back for the funeral, the orchard was already starting its slow surrender to nature. Now it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind that doesn't end well. I'd hired a local kid, Andrew Brennan, to help me haul stuff to the dump. His mom had been friends with my mom back in high school, and he needed money for community college. He showed up on Monday morning in a pickup truck that sounded like it was held together by prayer and duct tape. We started in the attic, where Dad had stored everything he couldn't bear to throw away. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, my school projects from elementary school. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. The photo fell out of a water-damaged cardboard box labeled Kitchen Misk, in Mom's handwriting. I almost missed it, would have if the corner hadn't caught the light just right. It was a Polaroid. The colors faded to that weird orange-yellow tint they get after a few decades. 5 teenage girls stood in a line, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. They were dressed in that unmistakable late 80s style, all big hair and acid-wash denim and neon windbreakers. I recognized Mom immediately, second from the left, her dark hair permed into oblivion. She couldn't have been more than 16, maybe 17. The photo had been taken in front of our orchard. I could see the neat rows of apple trees in the background before they'd gone wild. Someone had written on the white border at the bottom in blue pen, "Summer 1987, best friends forever." I flipped it over. On the back, in different handwriting, were 5 names: Diane, Julie, Mom's name, Vanessa, and Christine. I'd never seen this photo before. Mom had hardly any pictures from her teenage years, said she didn't like having her photo taken back then. But here she was, looking genuinely happy, surrounded by girls I'd never heard her mention. I showed it to Andrew, who was wrestling with a box of old National Geographic magazines. He glanced at it and shrugged. "Looks like your mom had friends," he said. "That's the orchard, right?" Before it went crazy. I asked if he recognized any of the other girls, if their families still lived in town. He squinted at the photo, then pointed to the girl on the far right, a blonde with a prominent gap between her front teeth. That might be Christine Holloway. "There's still a Holloway family on Birch Road, but I don't know if they're related." He handed the photo back to me and went back to the magazines. Something about it bothered me, though, the way it had been tucked away in a random box, like someone had hidden it deliberately. That night after Andrew left, I sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of Dad's old whiskey and stared at those 5 smiling faces. Mom's smile looked different than I remembered it, more open, less weighted down by whatever had made her so quiet in her later years. The next morning, I drove into town with the photo in my jacket pocket. The Millbridge Public Library was in the same building as the town hall, a brick structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Mrs. Galloway, the librarian who'd been there since before I was born, looked up from her desk with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when I walked in. I told her I was doing some family history research, that I'd found an old photo of my mom and wanted to learn more about her friends. She got very still when I showed her the picture. Her finger traced over the faces, lingering on each one. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I told her it had been in a box in the attic. She handed it back quickly, like it had burned her. "Those girls," she said, then stopped. "Most of them moved away a long time ago. You know how it is with small towns? People leave." But there was something in the way she said it, something rehearsed, like she'd told this story before and had gotten good at making it sound casual. I pressed her, asked specifically about each name. Mrs. Galloway's jaw tightened. "Diane moved to California in 1988. Julie, I think she went to New York. Vanessa, maybe Florida. Christine stayed the longest, but she left too. Must have been 1989 or 1990. Every answer came out too quickly, too prepared. I asked if she had yearbooks from that era. Maybe I could find more information about them. She told me the yearbooks from those years had been damaged in a flood in the basement back in 2003. Most of them were thrown out. Convenient, I thought, but didn't say. I thanked her and left, but as I reached the door, she called out, "Your mother wouldn't want you digging into this." I turned around. Into what? She just shook her head and went back to her computer, fingers trembling slightly as they found the keyboard. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting. The whole conversation felt wrong. People don't react like that to a simple question about old high school friends, not unless there's something to hide. I spent the rest of that day at the town hall, going through old newspaper archives on microfiche. The Millbridge Gazette was a weekly paper, mostly local sports and town council meetings, but I figured disappearances would make the news. I searched every issue from 1987 through 1992. Nothing. Not a single article about missing girls, runaways, or disappearances. There were obituaries, sure, but none for anyone matching those names or ages. What I did find was strange in its absence. There were gaps in the papers, issues that should have existed but didn't. July 1987 was missing. October 1988 had 3 consecutive weeks gone. Spring of 1989, another gap. I asked the clerk about it, a young guy who clearly didn't care much about his job. He said sometimes issues got damaged or lost over the years, it happens, but the pattern felt deliberate. Those weren't random gaps. I drove to the address Andrew had mentioned, the Holloway place on Birch Road. It was a small ranch house with peeling yellow paint and a yard full of cars in various states of disrepair. An older man answered the door, maybe in his 70s, with suspicious eyes and a Boston Red Sox cap pulled low. I introduced myself, said I was looking for information about Christine Holloway. His face changed instantly, not sad, but angry. "You a reporter?" he asked, his hand tightening on the doorframe. I told him no, that I was just trying to learn about my mom's old friends. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Christine ran away in 1989. Took off in the middle of the night, didn't leave a note, nothing. Police said she was 18, free to go where she wanted. End of story." But his voice cracked when he said her name. I asked if he'd ever heard from her after she left. He shook his head. "Not a word in 36 years. Her mother died thinking Christine hated us. You want to know the truth? The truth is this town let her disappear and nobody gave a damn." He started to close the door, then stopped. "Your uncle was the police chief back then, Harold Weaver. He told us Christine was a troubled girl, that she'd probably gone to find herself in some city somewhere. He said we should let it go, that she'd come back when she was ready. We believed him." The door shut in my face before I could respond. Uncle Harold. Mom's older brother, the one who died of a heart attack when I was 12. I barely remembered him, just a stern man in a uniform who showed up at family holidays and didn't smile much. When I got back to the house, Andrew was loading broken furniture into his truck. I asked him if he knew anything about girls disappearing in the late 80s. He stopped mid-lift, an old chair suspended in his arms. "My mom mentioned something once," he said slowly. "She said there were some girls who left town back when she was in high school. But she got really weird when I asked about it, told me it was ancient history and I should focus on my own life." He set the chair down. "Why are you asking?" I showed him the photo again, explained what I'd learned. He looked uncomfortable. "Look, I need this job, but I don't want to get involved in something that's going to piss off the whole town. My family lives here." I told him I understood, that he didn't have to help me with this part. But then he said something that made my chest tighten. "There's an old storage unit out by Route 7. Police department used to keep evidence there before they built the new station. My uncle works maintenance for the facility. He said most of the old units haven't been touched in decades. If your uncle kept anything, it might still be there." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mom, about how quiet she'd been my whole life. how she never talked about her childhood or her friends. How she'd sometimes stare out at the orchard with this look on her face, like she was seeing something that wasn't there anymore. I'd always assumed she was just sad about getting older, about how time changes things. But now I wondered if she'd been carrying something heavier. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and went down to the kitchen. The house made different sounds at night, creaks and groans I'd forgotten about. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop, searching for any information I could find about the other girls. Diane, Julie, Vanessa. Nothing came up. No social media profiles, no obituaries, no marriage records, nothing. It was like they'd been erased. 5 girls in one photo, and 4 of them had vanished without leaving a single digital footprint. In a world where everyone exists online in some form, that kind of absence isn't accidental. Somebody had worked very hard to make sure these girls stayed gone, at least on paper. I thought about Uncle Harold, about his position of authority, about how easy it would be for a small-town police chief to make inconvenient questions disappear along with inconvenient people. The storage facility was a depressing row of metal units behind a chain-link fence, the kind of place that rents month to month and doesn't ask questions. Andrew's uncle, a heavy-set man named Don with nicotine-stained fingers, met me there on Wednesday morning. I'd told him I was looking for some of my uncle's old police files for a family history project. He didn't seem to care either way. "Unit 23, he said, handing me a key that looked like it hadn't been used in years. "Haven't seen anyone access that one since before I started working here, and that was 2007. You find anything valuable? The department technically still owns it." The unit smelled like mildew and rust when I rolled up the door. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, most of them labeled with case numbers and dates. I started pulling them down, searching for anything from 1987 to 1990. Most of it was routine stuff, traffic violations, petty theft reports, one domestic dispute case. Then, in a box marked MISC 1988-1989, I found a folder that made my hands go numb. It was labeled Informal Investigations, in Uncle Harold's handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings from other states, articles about unidentified remains found in rural areas. He'd circled certain details in red pen, details about age, gender, approximate time of death. There were also Polaroids, dozens of them, taken in the orchard behind my house. They showed disturbed earth, areas where the ground had clearly been dug up and refilled. Each photo had a date written on the back: July 1987, October 1988, April 1989, May 1989. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the concrete floor. The dates matched the gaps in the newspaper archives. They matched the timeline of when the girls supposedly ran away. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and took pictures of everything in that folder. Every article, every photo, every note. There was a handwritten log too, Uncle Harold's daily notes. Most entries were mundane, but scattered throughout were lines that made my stomach turn. Spoke with Holloway family again. They're accepting the runaway story. Diane's parents finally stopped calling. Convincing people these girls wanted to leave is easier than I thought. Small-town prejudices work in my favor. And then, near the end of the log, one entry that broke something inside me. "Spoke to my sister today. She knows, she's always known. But she won't say anything. Family protects family, even when it shouldn't." My mother had known. She'd known what happened to her friends, and she'd stayed silent for the rest of her life, carrying that weight alone because her brother was a murderer, and she couldn't bring herself to turn him in. I drove straight to the Vermont State Police Barracks in Rutland, 40 minutes away, with the folder on my passenger seat. I didn't trust anyone in Millbridge. The detective I spoke with, a woman named Carver, listened to everything without interrupting. When I showed her the photos and the log, her expression went from skeptical to grave. She made calls, and within hours, a forensics team was on its way to my property. They spent 3 days searching the orchard with ground-penetrating radar. They found 4 sets of remains buried in shallow graves exactly where Uncle Harold's photos indicated: Diane, Julie, Vanessa, and Christine. The 5th girl in the photo, my mother, had been the sole survivor, the one who got away because she was his sister. And even monsters sometimes have limits. The town exploded with the news. Some people were horrified, others were angry that I'd dug up the past. Mrs. Galloway refused to speak to anyone. Christine's father called me, sobbing, saying he'd waited 36 years to know what happened to his daughter, and thanking me for giving him that closure, even though it came with such terrible truth. I sold the house within a month. Couldn't stand to be there anymore. The orchard was excavated completely, turned into a memorial garden for the victims. Before I left Vermont for good, I went back one last time and stood where that photo had been taken in 1987. 5 girls smiling at the camera, none of them knowing that 4 would be dead within 2 years, and the 5th would spend the rest of her life drowning in guilt and silence. I understood now why Mom had been so quiet, why she never wanted to talk about her past, why she'd look at the orchard with that haunted expression. She'd been looking at their graves, living above the evidence of her brother's crimes, knowing the truth but never speaking it, protecting a monster because he was family. I'll never know if she stayed silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty, and maybe it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that those 4 girls finally got to go home to their families, even if it was 3 decades too late. I still have that photo, tucked away in a drawer I rarely open. Sometimes I take it out and look at those 5 faces, all that youth and possibility, and I think about how one person's evil can ripple through generations, destroying not just the victims but everyone connected to them. The house sold to a family from Massachusetts who had no idea about its history. I didn't tell them. Maybe that makes me like my mother, keeping secrets to protect people from ugly truths. Or maybe some stories need to be buried along with the dead. I don't know anymore. What I do know is that I'll never go back to Millbridge, and every time I see an apple orchard, I drive past it as fast as I can. People always ask why I became a journalist, and I usually give them some noble answer about truth and accountability. The real reason is simpler and darker than that. It started the day I came home to Cypress Bend, Louisiana to pack up my father's house after his funeral. Dad had been the town clerk for 40 years before retiring in 2014, and he'd kept everything. Every document, every file, every scrap of paper that passed through the municipal building ended up in our garage or attic. My older sister Kathleen refused to deal with it, said she had 3 kids and a husband to worry about, so the job fell to me. I'd just turned 36 the week before Dad died. No wife, no kids, just a decent job at a newspaper in Atlanta covering city council meetings and zoning disputes. The kind of stories that put people to sleep. I took a month's leave and drove the 9 hours back to the place I'd spent my whole childhood trying to escape. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always do. It sat on Magnolia Avenue, a street that used to be nice before the chemical plant laid off half the town in 2008. Dad's Toyota was still in the driveway, covered in that yellow pollen that coats everything in Louisiana during spring. It was a Saturday in May, humid as hell, and the cicadas were already screaming in the oak trees. I'd been dreading this for weeks. Not just because of the grief, but because I knew what waited inside. Dad had been a hoarder of the bureaucratic kind. The living room was stacked with banker's boxes, the hallway lined with filing cabinets, the spare bedroom converted into what he called his archive. Mom had left him over it back when I was in college, said she couldn't live in a museum anymore. She'd remarried and moved to Florida, sent flowers to the funeral but didn't come. I couldn't blame her. The house smelled like old paper and the lemon cleaner Dad used obsessively, trying to keep the mold at bay. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag, looking at the mountain of work ahead, and seriously considered just hiring an estate sale company to deal with all of it. I started in the garage because it seemed the least personal. Boxes were stacked to the ceiling, labeled in Dad's careful block letters. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Tax records, water bills from 1987, permits for shed construction, complaints about barking dogs, boring, mundane stuff that should have been thrown out decades ago. I worked methodically, creating piles for trash, recycling, and the maybe 5% worth keeping. By noon, I was covered in dust and spider webs, my back aching from bending over boxes. I'd filled 6 garbage bags and barely made a dent. That's when I found them, pushed way back in the corner behind a rusted lawnmower and some old paint cans. 4 boxes, sealed with packing tape that had gone brown and brittle with age. The labels were different from Dad's usual style, written in black marker, hurried and uneven. Flood Relief 93, do not open. The thing is, I remembered 1993. I was 7 years old when the flood hit. School got canceled for 2 weeks, and we had to stay with my aunt in Baton Rouge because water came up to our porch steps. It was the biggest disaster in Cypress Bend's history, the whole downtown underwater, people living in the high school gymnasium for months. But what struck me standing in that garage was the second part of the label. Why would Dad write, "Do not open," on relief documents? I pulled one of the boxes out, the cardboard soft with moisture damage despite being sealed. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it to Dad's workbench and grabbed a utility knife from the pegboard. My journalist instincts were kicking in now, that familiar buzz I got when something didn't add up. I cut through the tape, and the smell hit me first. Old paper, but also something else, something chemical and wrong. Inside were files, hundreds of them, organized with the same precision Dad brought to everything. But these weren't relief documents. They were missing persons reports. Dozens of them, maybe 50 or 60 in just this one box. Each form was the official kind, the Louisiana State Police template with the seal at the top. But someone had stamped them all with red ink. Not processed. I pulled one out at random. A woman named Gloria Thibodeau, 41 years old, last seen at her home on Riverside Court on Wednesday, June 9, 1993. The report was filed by her sister on June 15th. There was a Polaroid photo paperclipped to the form, showing a smiling woman with dark curly hair standing in front of a small yellow house. I grabbed another file. James Ortega, 19, last seen leaving his job at the marina on the same date, June 9th. Another photo, a skinny kid with a work uniform and a shy smile. Then another, Carolyn Dufresne and her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11. All last seen June 9th, 1993. All reported missing in the days after. All stamped, not processed. My heart started pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the garage heat. June 9th, 1993 was the day the levee broke. I remembered because it was my grandmother's birthday, and we were supposed to have cake that evening, but never did because the sirens started going off around 3 in the afternoon. The Riverside neighborhood got hit first and worst, the water coming in so fast that people barely had time to get to their roofs. The news said it was 20 feet deep in some places. I grabbed my phone and started Googling, pulling up the old newspaper archives from the Cypress Bend Chronicle. The official death toll from the flood was listed as 7 people. 7. I had at least 30 missing persons reports in my hands from just one box, and there were 3 more boxes in that corner. I started pulling files faster, my hands getting that tremble you get when you're onto something big. Every single report had the same date, June 9th, 1993. Every single person was from Riverside, and every single form had that red stamp. Someone had deliberately not processed these reports. Someone had made these people disappear from the official record. I spent the next 4 hours going through all 4 boxes. By the time I finished, I'd counted 147 missing persons reports. 147 people who vanished the day of the flood, all from the same neighborhood, all officially erased. The files included everything you'd expect: detailed descriptions, last known locations, family contacts, even some personal effects that had been turned in. A wallet, a set of house keys, a child's stuffed rabbit, water-stained and falling apart. Someone had taken these reports seriously enough to collect evidence, but then buried them. I found something else too, tucked into the bottom of the last box. A manila envelope marked, "Engineering Survey, Confidential." Inside were blueprints of the levee system, covered in notations and calculations in different handwriting. Yellow sticky notes were attached to several pages, and one note made my stomach turn. It was dated June 8, 1993, the day before the flood. The handwriting was shaky but legible. Charges placed as requested. Primary breach point north sector will direct flow to Riverside. Detonation window 2:04 p.m. Wednesday. God forgive us. I sat down hard on Dad's workbench stool, my legs suddenly unreliable. Someone had blown the levee on purpose. They deliberately flooded Riverside, and my father had known about it. The evidence was in his garage, hidden for 31 years. I thought about Dad's last few months, how he'd gotten quiet and withdrawn, how he'd stopped going to church even though he'd been an usher for 20 years, how he'd called me 3 times in the weeks before his heart attack, leaving rambling messages about needing to tell me something important. But I'd been busy with a story deadline and kept saying I'd call him back later. I never did. Now he was gone, and I was holding proof of mass murder. I pulled out my laptop and started searching for anything about Riverside neighborhood. What I found made everything worse. After the flood, the land had been declared unusable, too damaged to rebuild. The entire neighborhood, 43 acres, had been sold to a development company for next to nothing. That company was owned by the Prudhomme family. Everyone in Cypress Bend knew the Prudhommes. They owned half the parish, had for generations. Sugar cane plantations, timber operations, commercial real estate. The family estate sat on a hill overlooking the river, a white mansion with columns that had been there since before the Civil War. In 1993, the patriarch was Jean-Paul Prudhomme, and according to the property records I was pulling up, his holdings had been directly upstream from Riverside. If the levee had broken naturally where it was supposed to, the water would have flooded his processing plant and 5,000 acres of prime agricultural land. But by breaching it at the north sector instead, the water got diverted away from his property and straight into Riverside, a poor neighborhood where most people rented, where nobody had the money or connections to fight back. I found a photo from the Chronicle dated June 11, 1993, showing Jean-Paul touring the flood damage with the governor. He looked concerned in that practiced way rich people do, wearing rubber boots that probably cost more than most people's rent. The caption mentioned his generous donation to the relief fund. Blood money. I couldn't stay in that garage anymore. I loaded all 4 boxes into my car, then went back for the engineering documents. It was almost 7 in the evening, the sun setting orange and angry through the humidity. I sat in my car with the air conditioning blasting, trying to figure out what to do next. The smart move would be to call the FBI, hand everything over, let the professionals handle it. But I'd been a journalist long enough to know how these things went. The Prudhommes had money, real money, the kind that bought lawyers and politicians and made evidence disappear. Jean-Paul was dead now, had been for a decade, but his son Olivier ran the family business and sat on every important board in the parish. One phone call from him and this whole thing could get buried again, just like Dad had buried it. No, I needed to document everything first, build an airtight case, and then go public in a way that couldn't be ignored. I drove to the one place in Cypress Bend I knew would have the records I needed, the parish courthouse. The building was closed, but I'd grown up in this town and knew things tourists didn't. The records room had a separate entrance in the back, and the night security guard was Billy Fontaine, who'd been 2 grades ahead of me in school. I knocked on the maintenance door until he opened it, looking annoyed until he recognized me. We talked for 10 minutes about Dad's funeral, about his own father's diabetes, about how the town wasn't what it used to be. Then I told him I needed to look at some property records for a story I was writing. and he let me in without asking questions. Small town courtesy, the kind that can save you or destroy you depending on who's watching. I spent 3 hours in that records room, photographing everything. Deeds, tax assessments, water management reports, environmental surveys. I found the original engineering specifications for the levee, which showed the north sector was actually reinforced concrete, the strongest point in the entire system. For it to fail there naturally would have been nearly impossible. I found insurance claims too, dozens of them, all denied because flood insurance didn't cover acts of God back then. People lost everything and got nothing. The last thing I found was a memo dated June 15, 1993, from the Parish Emergency Management Office to all local law enforcement. It ordered them to halt processing of any missing persons reports from Riverside until further notice, citing the need to avoid premature panic and allow time for thorough rescue operations. The memo was signed by the emergency coordinator, a man named Frank Boudreau, but at the bottom was a handwritten note, per prud'homme request. That's when I understood what Dad had done. He hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd been the one person who'd refused to destroy the evidence. Everyone else had followed orders, but Dad had kept those reports, hidden them, preserved them for 31 years until someone could do something about it. He'd tried to tell me before he died, and I'd been too busy to listen. I left the courthouse at midnight with my phone full of documentation and a plan forming in my head. I couldn't trust the local police. Half of them probably owed their jobs to Prud'homme donations. But I had friends at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and I had enough evidence to make this national news. I drove back to Dad's house, uploaded everything to 3 different cloud services, and sent encrypted files to 2 journalist colleagues with instructions to publish if anything happened to me. Then I finally allowed myself to feel it, the weight of what I'd discovered, and I cried for the first time since Dad's funeral. The story broke 6 days later. I'd spent that time tracking down survivors, people who'd lost family members in Riverside and never got answers. Most had moved away, scattered across Louisiana and beyond. But they all remembered. They remembered filing reports that went nowhere, remembered being told their loved ones probably just left town, remembered the way people stopped asking questions when the Prud'homme name came up. I interviewed 23 people, recorded every conversation, documented every detail. When the Times-Picayune published the first article, it included photographs of the missing persons reports, scans of the engineering documents, and testimony from the survivors. The headline read, "Cypress Bend Flood of '93. New evidence suggests deliberate levee breach killed over 140. Within hours, every major news outlet in the country picked it up. CNN, NBC, The Washington Post. By the end of the week, the FBI had opened an investigation, and the Louisiana Attorney General announced a special task force. Olivier Prud'homme released a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory, but his lawyers couldn't explain away the documents. The physical evidence was too damning, too specific, too real. 3 months later, they found the bodies. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the old Riverside neighborhood, which was now a shopping center and parking lot, revealed multiple unmarked burial sites. The excavation took weeks, but they eventually recovered remains of 68 people, including children. DNA testing confirmed their identities matched names from Dad's missing persons reports. The medical examiner determined most had drowned, but some showed signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting they'd been caught in the initial blast when the levee was breached. Olivier Prud'homme was indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to conceal evidence. He maintained his father had acted alone, but financial records showed he'd paid off 3 parish officials as recently as 2023 to keep the Riverside files sealed. Frank Boudreau, the old emergency coordinator, confessed in exchange for immunity. He confirmed Jean-Paul Prud'homme had ordered the levee breach and paid the demolition crew $500,000 in cash. The crew members were dead now, conveniently all of natural causes over the past decade. But Boudreaux's testimony was enough. The trial starts next month, and I'll be there to cover every minute of it. I still live in Cypress Bend now. Quit my job in Atlanta and took a position at the Chronicle, the same paper that once published puff pieces about Jean-Paul's charity work. They made me investigative editor, gave me full freedom to dig into whatever stories the town tried to bury. Kathleen speaks to me again, said she's proud of what I did, even if it means the family name is complicated around here. Some people treat me like a hero, others won't make eye contact at the grocery store. The Prud'hommes still have friends, still have money, still have power, but they don't have silence anymore. Dad's house sold last month, and I used part of the money to help fund a memorial for the Riverside victims. It's a simple granite wall with all 147 names engraved, located on the only piece of the old neighborhood that wasn't developed, a small park by the river. At the dedication ceremony, survivors came from all over the country. They touched the names, cried, finally had a place to grieve. I think about Dad standing in that garage looking at those boxes year after year, carrying the weight of what he knew and couldn't fix. He did what he could with what he had, and in the end, that was enough. The truth came out, even if it took 31 years and his death to make it happen. Sometimes justice is just someone refusing to let the world forget. Honestly, I never thought I'd be the person posting something like this online, but I need to get it out somewhere because talking about it in person makes me feel sick all over again. My wife Claire and I got married in June 2014, right after I finished my teaching degree. We were broke as hell, living off her salary as a dental hygienist while I scrambled for substitute teaching gigs around the county. When we found that rental house on the edge of Fairmont, Pennsylvania, it felt like we'd won the lottery. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a little backyard for the dog we planned to get someday, all for $800 a month. The landlord, this guy named Vincent Marsh, seemed normal enough when we met him at the property. Mid-50s, thinning gray hair, wore these thick-framed glasses that made his eyes look huge. He smiled a lot, maybe too much, but we figured he was just eager to rent the place after it sat empty for 3 months. We moved in on a Saturday in late July, and I remember thinking the house had good bones despite the outdated wallpaper and the weird, musty smell in the hallway closet. Claire was already planning which walls we'd repaint, talking about hanging curtains in the bedroom to block out the streetlight that shone directly through our window at night. That first week felt like playing house, you know. We'd order pizza and eat it on the floor, because our furniture hadn't arrived yet, making plans about the life we were going to build there. Vincent stopped by twice that week, once to fix a leaky faucet and another time to check the furnace before winter, he said. Both times he lingered longer than necessary, asking questions about our schedules, when we'd be home, whether we were light sleepers. Claire mentioned later that she thought it was weird how he kept glancing toward our bedroom door, but I brushed it off. Landlords are nosy, right? They want to make sure you're not trashing their property. I wish I'd paid more attention to the way his hands trembled when he handed me his business card, or how he wrote his personal cell number on the back in pen that smudged across the paper like he'd been sweating. It was Claire who noticed the first hole. We'd been living there almost 3 weeks when she decided to rearrange the bedroom furniture. She wanted the bed against the far wall instead of under the window, thought it would help us sleep better without that streetlight blazing into our faces every night. When we pushed the dresser away from the corner, there it was, right at eye level if you were standing in the hallway outside. A perfectly round hole, maybe half an inch across, drilled straight through the drywall. The edges were smooth, deliberate, and when I put my eye up to it, I could see directly into our bedroom, a clear view of where our bed had been positioned for the past 3 weeks. My throat got tight. Claire grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging in hard enough to leave marks. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably just a minute, both of us trying to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenant hung something heavy. Maybe there was some electrical work done, but the hole was too clean, too purposeful, and it was aimed at exactly the right height and angle. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and started checking the other walls, moving furniture, pulling down the few pictures we'd hung. We found 2 more in the bedroom alone. One behind the nightstand on Claire's side, another near the closet that gave a perfect view of where she changed clothes every morning before work. The panic really set in when we checked the bathroom. I had to move the towel rack to find it, but there it was. Another hole drilled through the wall that separated the bathroom from the utility closet in the hallway. This one was positioned to see directly into the shower. Claire started crying, the kind of crying where you can't catch your breath, and I felt this rage building in my chest that made my vision blur at the edges. We'd been showering there for 3 weeks. We'd been sleeping there, changing there, doing everything married people do in the privacy of their own home. I wanted to punch something, wanted to drive straight to Vincent's house and drag him out by his collar, but Claire begged me to call the police first. She was shaking so badly I had to dial the number for her. When the dispatcher answered, I tried to explain what we'd found, but the words came out jumbled and probably didn't make much sense. The dispatcher kept asking if we were in immediate danger, if someone was in the house right now, and I kept saying no, but yes. Someone had been watching us. Someone had violated us in a way I couldn't even articulate. They said they'd send an officer over within the hour. That hour felt like a decade. While we waited, I couldn't just sit there. I went into the hallway closet, the one with that musty smell we'd never bothered investigating, and started pulling out the boxes of Christmas decorations and old paint cans the previous tenant had left behind. At the back of the closet, behind a sheet of plywood leaning against the wall, I found the access panel to the crawl space above the first floor. The panel wasn't screwed in like it should have been. It just lifted right off. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, boosted myself up, and shone the flashlight into the darkness above. What I saw made my stomach turn inside out. There were wires everywhere, thin black cables running along the ceiling joists like veins, all converging toward a central point above our bedroom. I followed them with the flashlight beam and found a small metal box bolted to a beam, about the size of a lunchbox, with more wires feeding into it from different directions. Some of the cables disappeared into holes drilled down through the ceiling, positioned exactly where we'd found the holes in the walls below. I'm not an electrician, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't original wiring. This was new, maybe a few months old based on how clean the plastic coating looked. Claire called up to me asking what I'd found, but I couldn't form words. I just climbed down and showed her the pictures I'd taken on my phone. Her face went completely white. The officer who showed up was young, couldn't have been more than a year or 2 out of the academy. His name was Officer Reynolds, and he had this uncomfortable expression like he'd been expecting a noise complaint, not whatever mess we were describing. He looked at the holes, took some pictures with a department camera, then asked if he could see the crawl space. I took him up there, and I watched his expression change from skeptical to deeply concerned as he swept his own flashlight across the wiring. He made a phone call, spoke in that clipped cop voice they use on radios, and within 20 minutes, 2 detectives showed up. Detective Brenner was older, maybe 50, with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. His partner was a woman named Detective Huang, sharp and focused, already pulling on latex gloves before she'd even climbed into the crawl space. They spent 45 minutes up there talking in low voices we couldn't quite hear, occasionally asking us questions through the opening. Had we touched anything? Had we noticed anyone unusual around the property? Did the landlord have keys? That last question hit different. Of course he had keys. He was the landlord. He could come and go whenever he wanted, and we'd never know. Detective Huang came down from the crawl space holding an evidence bag with the metal box inside. She set it on our kitchen table like it was radioactive, and Brenner explained what they'd found. The box was a wireless transmitter, the kind you could buy online for a few $100s, designed to send video signals to a remote receiver. The wires fed into tiny cameras, pinhole style, fitted into the holes we'd discovered. 4 cameras total, they'd counted. Bedroom, bathroom, and 2 in the living room we hadn't even found yet because they were hidden behind air vents. Huang asked if we'd given permission for any surveillance equipment, which was such an absurd question I almost laughed. Then Brenner asked for Vincent's contact information, and I handed over that business card with his smudged cell number. They tried calling him right there in front of us. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. Brenner left a message, professional and calm, asking Vincent to call back regarding an urgent matter at the property. We all knew he wouldn't call back. You could see it in the way the detectives looked at each other. That silent communication cops develop after working together long enough. Huang asked if we had anywhere else to stay tonight. The way she said it, like it wasn't really a question, made it clear we shouldn't be sleeping there. We ended up at Claire's parents' house in Harrisburg, about an hour away. Her mom kept trying to make tea and asking if we were hungry, doing that thing parents do when they don't know how to fix something, so they offer food instead. Claire's dad just sat there looking furious, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metal box, those wires, Vincent's huge eyes behind those thick glasses staring at footage of us in our most private moments. How long had he been watching? Had he watched us on our wedding night when we came home late and exhausted? Had he seen every fight, every intimate moment, every time we walked around in our underwear thinking we were alone? The violation of it felt like something crawling under my skin. The next morning, Brenner called my cell. They'd gone to the address listed on Vincent's landlord registration. The house was empty. Not just empty like he wasn't home, but empty like he'd cleared out in a hurry. Neighbors said they'd seen him loading boxes into a van around midnight, just hours after we'd called the police. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail now, probably turned off or destroyed. They'd put out a bulletin for his vehicle, a white cargo van with Pennsylvania plates, but Brenner didn't sound optimistic about finding him quickly. What happened next is the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. 3 days after Vincent disappeared, Detective Huang called and asked if we could come down to the station. When we got there, she led us into a conference room where Brenner had spread out papers and photographs across the table, like some kind of horrifying puzzle. They'd started digging into Vincent's background, pulling property records and cross-referencing rental listings. Turns out our house wasn't the only one. Vincent owned 6 rental properties scattered across 3 counties in central Pennsylvania, all advertised as affordable housing for young couples and single women. The detectives had obtained warrants and searched every single property. 5 of them had the same setup. Holes in the walls, cameras hidden in bedrooms and bathrooms, wiring running to transmitters in crawl spaces or attics. One house in Altoona had 8 cameras installed. 8. Huang showed us a spreadsheet she'd created, listing the current and former tenants they'd identified going back 3 years. 22 people had lived in those houses during that time. 22 people who had no idea they'd been watched, recorded, violated in their own homes. Some had already moved away, gotten married, started families. The detectives were in the process of contacting everyone, and I could see the weight of it on Huang's face, knowing she'd have to make those phone calls and destroy people's sense of safety and privacy all over again. Brenner pulled out another folder, this one thicker, and explained that they'd executed a warrant for Vincent's financial records. He'd been paying for cloud storage, massive amounts of it, through an offshore service that specialized in, let's say, discretionary data hosting. The kind of service that doesn't ask questions and doesn't cooperate easily with law enforcement. They were working with federal investigators now because the scope had expanded beyond local jurisdiction. The FBI cybercrimes unit was involved, trying to trace where the footage had been uploaded and whether Vincent had distributed or sold any of it. That word "sold" hit me like a hammer. The idea that strangers might have paid money to watch me and Claire in our bedroom, that our most private moments might be saved on some server in another country, being traded around by people whose faces we'd never see. It made me want to vomit right there on the conference room table. Claire started crying again, and Huang pushed a box of tissues across the table with the kind of practiced gentleness that told me she'd done this too many times before. Brenner said they'd keep us updated, that they were doing everything possible to track Vincent down and secure any footage that might exist. But I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The internet is vast. Data can be copied, backed up, hidden in places even experts struggle to find. We never went back to that house. Claire couldn't even drive past the street without having a panic attack, and honestly, neither could I. We broke the lease, which legally we probably didn't have to do given the circumstances, but I didn't want to spend another second tied to anything Vincent owned. We moved into a cramped apartment in Harrisburg, closer to Claire's work and her family, a place with new construction and walls we could verify were solid all the way through. I became obsessive about checking for cameras. Every hotel room, every Airbnb, even bathrooms at friends' houses, I'd find myself scanning the walls and ceilings, looking for tiny holes or unusual objects positioned at weird angles. Claire started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma. She'd come home from sessions exhausted and raw, and some nights she'd just sit on the couch staring at nothing while I made dinner neither of us wanted to eat. Our marriage took a hit. Not because we blamed each other, but because the invasion had poisoned something fundamental between us. Intimacy became complicated, loaded with the knowledge that someone had stolen it from us, and we could never get it back. We got through it, slowly, with a lot of therapy and patience and honest conversations that hurt like open wounds. But it changed us. You don't come back from something like that completely whole. Vincent Marsh was arrested 4 months later at a border crossing in Texas, trying to get into Mexico with fake identification. The cargo van was full of hard drives and equipment. Turns out he'd been planning this for a while, had money stashed in accounts under different names, probably anticipating the day someone would discover what he'd been doing. The trial took 2 years, dragged out by legal motions and evidence processing. The FBI recovered footage from multiple cloud accounts, thousands of hours of recordings spanning back to 2011. He'd been doing this for at least a decade, maybe longer. 22 victims became 43 as more people came forward after seeing news coverage. Some of the footage had been sold on dark web forums, distributed to networks of people who paid subscription fees to watch real surveillance of unsuspecting people. Vincent pleaded guilty eventually, probably because his lawyers knew a jury would bury him. He got 38 years in federal prison, no parole. He'll be 90 when he's eligible for release, if he lives that long. Huang called me the day the sentence came down. She said it was one of the longest sentences she'd seen for this type of crime, that the judge had been visibly disgusted during sentencing. It should have felt like victory, like justice, but mostly I just felt tired. Claire and I were in our new house by then, a place we'd bought instead of rented, where we'd personally inspected every inch before signing the papers. We're okay now, or as okay as you can be after something like this. We don't talk about it much anymore, but sometimes I catch Claire staring at a wall with that distant look, and I know she's back there, in that bedroom on the edge of Fairmont, realizing someone was watching. The violation doesn't fade. You just learn to carry it differently. And every time I hear about someone finding a great deal on a rental, I want to tell them to check the walls first. Check everything. Because privacy is an illusion, and trust is a luxury not everyone deserves. Teaching 5th grade in Dalton felt like the kind of quiet life I needed after the chaos of my divorce 2 years prior. The town had maybe 8,000 people, tucked between the mountains in northwest Georgia, where everyone knew everyone and Sunday service at Covenant Fellowship wasn't optional, if you wanted to fit in. I started attending because my principal, Mr. Warren, mentioned it during my interview, saying the church was the heart of the community and most of the school staff were members. Within my first month, I'd been welcomed with casseroles, invitations to potlucks, and warm smiles from people who seemed genuinely kind. The church itself was this beautiful old building with white columns and stained glass windows that threw colored light across the pews during morning service. Everything felt safe, normal, like I'd finally found a place where I could rebuild my life and focus on my students without the drama I'd left behind in Savannah. But sometime around mid-October, I started noticing small things that didn't quite add up. After service one Sunday, I saw 3 of my colleagues, including Beth Sullivan, who taught 3rd grade, huddled in the parking lot with Deacon Phillips and 2 other church elders I didn't know well. They were speaking in hushed tones, and when I waved at Beth, she looked almost startled before giving me this tight, forced smile and turning back to the group. The conversation stopped completely when I walked past them to my car. Then there was the Wednesday evening Bible study I'd started attending, where certain members would exchange these meaningful glances whenever someone mentioned the community committee, which I'd been told was just a charity organization that helped struggling families in the area. I'd asked about volunteering once, and the room had gone uncomfortably silent before someone changed the subject. People were friendly enough to my face, but I was starting to feel like there was this whole other layer to the church that I wasn't part of, like everyone was in on something I didn't understand. The warmth I'd initially felt was beginning to seem performative, calculated even, though I couldn't explain why I felt that way. The thing that really kicked everything into gear happened on a Monday morning in late October. I arrived at school to find out that Beth Sullivan had resigned effective immediately. No 2 weeks notice, no goodbye, nothing. Her classroom was already being packed up by the janitor, and when I asked Mr. Warren about it, he got this weird look on his face and said Beth had personal matters to attend to and had moved out of state to be with family. But here's the thing that made my stomach turn. I'd had coffee with Beth just 3 days earlier, on Friday afternoon, and she'd been excitedly planning her classroom Halloween party. She'd shown me the decorations she'd bought, talked about how her kids were going to love the costume contest, and mentioned she was hosting Thanksgiving at her house this year for the first time. She didn't seem like someone about to uproot her entire life. I tried calling her cell phone during my lunch break, and it went straight to a disconnected number message. Her Facebook page was gone. It was like she'd been erased. I couldn't stop thinking about it for the rest of the week. During Wednesday evening service, I noticed Beth's usual seat in the 4th pew was occupied by a family I'd never seen before, like the congregation had just moved on without missing a beat. After the service ended, I approached Deacon Phillips and asked if he knew how to reach Beth, saying I wanted to send her a card or something. The way his expression shifted made my chest tighten. He put his hand on my shoulder, this gesture that probably looked comforting to anyone watching, but his grip was firm enough to feel like a warning. He told me that Beth had made her choice, and it was best to respect her privacy and focus on my own responsibilities here. The way he emphasized here felt deliberate, pointed. When I mentioned that her phone was disconnected, he just smiled and said sometimes people need to make clean breaks, then walked away before I could ask anything else. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the conversation and realizing he'd never actually answered my question about how to contact her. Nobody had. The next Sunday I decided to do something probably stupid, but I couldn't help myself. After service, I lingered near the fellowship hall where coffee and donuts were set up, and I started casually asking other members if they'd heard from Beth. The reactions were all variations of the same theme: awkward pauses, quick subject changes, or these rehearsed-sounding responses about respecting her decision and moving forward. But it was Margaret Torres, the church secretary who'd always been chatty with me, who really confirmed my suspicions. When I asked her, she actually glanced around nervously before leaning in close and whispering that I should stop asking questions about Beth. Her exact words were, "Some people aren't cut out for the level of commitment this community requires, and it's better for everyone when they realize that sooner rather than later." When I pressed her on what she meant by commitment, she straightened up, plastered on a smile, and said she had to help clean up. practically speed walking away from me. The whole exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it left me feeling genuinely unsettled. What kind of church talks about commitment like it's some binding contract you can't get out of? I started paying closer attention after that, really watching how people interacted. The community committee met every other Friday evening in the church basement, and I'd see the same group of maybe 20 people heading down there. Always the same faces, including Mr. Warren, Deacon Phillips, and several other teachers from school. They'd stay for exactly 2 hours, and when they came back up, they always looked serious, purposeful, like they'd just attended some important business meeting, rather than a charity planning session. One Friday in early November, I made an excuse about leaving my sweater in the sanctuary and doubled back after everyone thought I'd left. I could hear voices coming from the basement, but the door at the top of the stairs was locked. I stood there for a minute, listening, and I could make out someone talking about maintaining the structure and ensuring compliance, which seemed like really weird language for organizing food drives or whatever they were supposedly doing. Then I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and I had to scramble back to my car, my heart absolutely pounding, feeling like a kid who'd almost gotten caught doing something wrong. What really sent me down the rabbit hole was finding Beth's lesson planner in the supply closet at school. I'd gone in looking for construction paper for my class, and there it was, shoved behind some boxes on the top shelf like someone had hidden it quickly. Her handwriting was all over it, plans sketched out through December, parent conference notes, everything. On the inside cover, she'd written her sister's phone number in California with a note that said, "Emily, emergency contact." I took a photo of the number with my phone and called it that evening from my apartment. A woman answered, and when I explained who I was and asked about Beth, there was this long, painful silence before she said Beth hadn't contacted any family members. Emily's voice cracked when she told me she'd filed a missing person report 2 weeks ago, but the police in Dalton had told her that Beth had resigned from her job voluntarily, and there was no evidence of foul play, so they weren't investigating. Emily said she'd driven down from California to look for her sister, had gone to the church and spoken with Deacon Phillips, and he'd told her the same story about Beth moving away for personal reasons. But Emily knew her sister, knew Beth would never just vanish without telling family, and she'd left Dalton feeling like everyone was lying to her but having no proof of anything. After I hung up with Emily, I sat on my couch for probably an hour just trying to process what this meant. A woman had vanished, her own sister couldn't find her, and an entire church congregation was apparently okay with pretending everything was normal. I thought about going to the police myself, but what would I even say? That people at my church were acting weird and my colleague had quit her job? There was nothing concrete, nothing illegal that I could point to. The next day at school, I noticed Mr. Warren watching me more closely than usual during the staff meeting. When it ended, he asked me to stay behind, and once everyone else had filed out, he closed the door and sat on the edge of his desk in this casual way that somehow made the whole thing feel more threatening. He asked how I was adjusting to the community, if I felt welcomed at church, and then he said he'd heard I'd been asking a lot of questions about Beth Sullivan. The way he looked at me when he said it made my mouth go dry. I tried to play it off, said I was just concerned about a friend, but he cut me off and said that sometimes curiosity can make a person's life more complicated than it needs to be. Those were his exact words. Then he smiled, told me he was sure I understood, and suggested I focus on being a positive presence for my students, rather than dwelling on people who'd chosen to move on. That conversation scared me more than anything else had up to that point, because it meant they knew I was digging, and they were watching me. I decided to back off for a while, attend church like normal, smile and nod, and pretend everything was fine. But I also started documenting things, writing down dates and names and strange interactions in a notebook I kept hidden in my apartment. 2 weeks later, on a Wednesday evening, I got a knock on my door around 8 at night. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Deacon Phillips standing there with 2 other men from the community committee, both wearing suits despite the late hour. My entire body went cold. I considered not answering, but my car was parked right outside, and all the lights in my apartment were on, so they obviously knew I was home. When I opened the door with the chain still latched, Deacon Phillips gave me that same unsettling smile and said they'd like to talk to me about joining the community committee. He said I'd shown such dedication to the church and the school that they felt I'd be a perfect addition to their organization. The way he phrased it didn't sound like an invitation. It sounded like an inevitability. I told them through the gap in the door that I appreciated the offer, but I was still fairly new to the area and wanted to settle in more before taking on additional commitments. One of the other men, someone whose name I didn't know but who I'd seen at every service, stepped closer and said that membership in the committee wasn't really optional for people who were serious about being part of the Covenant Fellowship community. He said it in this matter-of-fact tone, like he was explaining simple math to a child. Deacon Phillips added that everyone at the church who held any position of influence or respect was part of the committee, and that my principal, Mr. Warren, had specifically recommended me. He said they had a special initiation meeting this coming Friday, and they'd expect to see me there at 7 in the evening. When I started to protest, to say I needed time to think about it, the third man finally spoke up and mentioned how unfortunate it had been that Beth Sullivan hadn't understood the importance of commitment, how she'd made things difficult for herself by trying to walk away. The implicit threat in his words was crystal clear. I managed to tell them I'd think about it and close the door, then immediately pushed my couch against it and spent the rest of the night planning what the hell I was going to do. I knew I couldn't just refuse and stay in Dalton. Whatever this community committee actually was, they clearly had enough influence to make people disappear without consequences, and the local police were either part of it or too intimidated to investigate. By Thursday morning, I'd made my decision. I called in sick to school, went to the bank and withdrew everything from my checking account, and started packing only what would fit in my car. I didn't give notice to my landlord, didn't tell anyone at school I was leaving, didn't post anything on social media. I loaded up my sedan that afternoon while most people were still at work, threw my notebook with all my documentation into my bag, and planned to leave Friday morning before dawn, hours before that 7 o'clock meeting they expected me at. But Thursday night, around 11, I heard footsteps on the stairs leading up to my second-floor apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, and then they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath in the darkness, watching the shadow of feet visible under the door gap. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard a piece of paper slide under my door. When the footsteps finally retreated, I waited another 10 minutes before turning on a light and picking up the paper. It was a printed schedule for tomorrow's initiation ceremony, with my name already typed at the top, along with a note that said, "We look forward to welcoming you into our family. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity you won't want to miss." I didn't sleep at all that night. At 3 in the morning, I grabbed my bags, left my apartment key on the counter, and walked as quietly as I could down to my car. The street was completely empty and dark except for one streetlight flickering at the end of the block. I threw everything in the trunk, got in the driver's seat, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as the engine started, I saw headlights turn onto my street from the far end. A dark SUV moving slowly, like it was patrolling. I didn't wait to see if it was coming for me. I pulled out and drove in the opposite direction, taking back roads out of town, constantly checking my rearview mirror for anyone following me. I drove for 6 hours straight, didn't stop except for gas, and ended up at my cousin's place in North Carolina by mid-morning. I stayed with her for 2 weeks, barely leaving her apartment, jumping at every unexpected sound. I finally worked up the courage to call Emily, Beth's sister, and told her everything that had happened to me. She broke down crying and said she'd suspected something like this but had no way to prove it. Together, we contacted the FBI field office in Charlotte, and I turned over my notebook with all the documentation. An agent took my statement and said they'd look into it, but warned me that without concrete evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do immediately. He did say that Dalton had come up before in relation to some financial irregularities involving a church organization, and my information might help build a case, but it could take months or even years. He strongly advised me not to return to Dalton under any circumstances. It's been 8 months since I left, and I'm teaching at a different school now in a different state, using my maiden name from before my marriage. I check the news from Dalton compulsively, looking for any updates, but there's been nothing about the church or the community committee. Beth Sullivan is still listed as a missing person with no new developments. Emily texts me sometimes, and we both hold on to this thin hope that maybe the investigation will eventually uncover something. But I'm not holding my breath. What keeps me up at night is thinking about how many people might still be trapped in that system, too afraid to leave, or too deep into whatever that organization actually does. I've had nightmares where I'm back in that church basement, where the locked door opens and I see what they were really doing down there. But I always wake up before finding out. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed and fought harder to expose them, but then I remember the look in Deacon Phillips's eyes when he stood at my door, and I know I made the only choice I could. I'm safe now. I have a new job and a new start, but I'll never really feel settled again. I'll always be looking around corners, always wondering if someone from Covenant Fellowship might track me down, because I'm the one who got away and talked to the FBI. That's what they took from me, even though I escaped. They took my ability to ever feel completely safe again, to trust a community, to believe that friendly faces in a small town church are actually what they appear to be. And somewhere in Dalton, Georgia, they're still meeting every other Friday in that basement, still maintaining their structure and ensuring compliance, still making people disappear when they ask too many questions. Everyone wants the full story, but here's the thing, I can't give it to them. The detectives, the therapists, my own parents sitting across from me with those desperate eyes, they all want this clean narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. What I've got instead are these jagged pieces of memory that don't fit together right, like a puzzle someone threw against a wall. What I can tell you is where it started. A Friday night in September, me and 4 friends driving out to some abandoned trailer park off Highway 56 because we were 17 and stupid and thought we were invincible. My buddy Josh had been going on about this place for weeks, saying his older brother told him squatters had turned it into some kind of commune, the kind of place where people went to disappear on purpose, he said, which should have been our first clue to stay the hell away. But when you grow up in a Kansas town where watching wheat grow counts as entertainment, an abandoned trailer park 12 miles outside town sounds like the most interesting thing that's happened all year. I remember climbing into Josh's pickup that night, the 5 of us passing around cheap vodka, laughing about nothing, completely unaware we were driving towards something that would break us all in different ways. The trailer park sat at the end of a dirt road that carved through an old cornfield, the kind that had been left to rot into these tall, dried-out husks that scraped against the truck as we drove through. Someone had spray-painted a crooked arrow on a rusted mailbox where we turned off the highway, pointing us deeper into nowhere. When Josh's headlights finally swept across the clearing, I counted maybe a dozen trailers arranged in this weird circle, most of them sagging on one side or covered in thick vines that made them look like they were being swallowed by the earth. The whole place had this carnival after dark feeling, like something that was supposed to be fun once but had turned into something else entirely. We sat there in the truck for a minute after Josh cut the engine, and that's when I heard it, this low mechanical hum coming from somewhere in the darkness. A generator, I realized, which meant someone was using electricity out here. Amber, Josh's girlfriend, said maybe we should just go, that if people were actually living here we were trespassing. But Josh was already laughing it off. He said anyone squatting in a place like this wasn't going to call the cops on some teenagers. Kevin had his door open before any of us could argue further, flashlight already on, heading toward the nearest trailer like he owned the place. The rest of us followed because that's what you do when you're 17. You follow your friends into the dark, even when every instinct you have is screaming at you to run. The first trailer Kevin approached had its door hanging open, swaying slightly in the wind. He stepped inside and we heard him moving around, his footsteps creaking on what sounded like rotted floorboards. When he came back out, he said it was empty, except for some old furniture and needles scattered everywhere. The kind with the orange caps that you see in documentaries about the opioid crisis. Josh made some joke about junkies and we moved to the next trailer, then the next, finding more of the same. Stripped mattresses, broken glass, that sour smell of mildew and something worse underneath. Stephanie hung back near the truck, her arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. She kept saying she wanted to leave, that this place felt wrong, but nobody really listened to her. We were too busy trying to act braver than we felt, shining our flashlights into dark corners and daring each other to go deeper into the trailers. It was Josh who noticed the trailer at the far end of the circle looked different from the others. Newer, or at least better maintained. The windows had curtains, actual curtains, not just sheets, and there was a concrete block serving as a front step. No vines growing up the sides. That generator sound was louder near this one, definitely coming from underneath or behind it. Kevin said we should check it out and Josh agreed immediately, like this was some kind of adventure game and we were collecting points. I remember my heart was pounding harder than it should have been, this animal part of my brain sending up warning flares, but I followed anyway because the alternative was standing alone in the dark. We approached the trailer slowly, and that's when I noticed the door wasn't just closed. It had a deadbolt on the outside. A big industrial one, the kind you'd use on a storage unit, installed where someone inside couldn't reach it. Josh touched it and the metal was new. No rust like everything else in this place. Amber asked why anyone would lock a trailer from the outside and nobody had an answer that made sense. Kevin tried the door anyway and it swung open. Unlocked, and the smell that came out was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Chemical and sweet at the same time, with this underlying rot that made my eyes water. The inside was dark except for a faint blue glow coming from somewhere in the back. We stood in the doorway, none of us wanting to be the first one to step inside, and that's when we heard it. A sound like fabric dragging across floor, coming from deeper in the trailer. Something or someone was in there with us, moving in the darkness. Josh shined his flashlight toward the sound, and the beam landed on a figure slumped against the far wall, a woman maybe in her 20s or 30s. It was hard to tell. She was staring at us but not really seeing us, her eyes glassy and unfocused, and her lips were moving like she was talking but no sound was coming out. She wore a stained tank top and her arms were covered in track marks, some fresh enough that they still looked angry and red. Kevin started backing up immediately, saying we needed to get out of there, that this was someone's shooting gallery and we were going to get in serious trouble. But Amber moved forward instead, asking the woman if she was okay, if she needed help. The woman's head lolled to the side, and she made this wet clicking sound in her throat, and I realized she wasn't just high, she was barely conscious, maybe overdosing right in front of us. Stephanie was already running back to the truck, yelling that she was calling 911. But Josh grabbed her and said we couldn't call the cops because we'd been drinking and we'd all get arrested. We were arguing about what to do, our voices getting louder and more panicked, when I heard footsteps outside. Heavy boots on gravel, multiple sets coming from different directions. The generator sound cut out and everything went silent, except for those footsteps getting closer. I don't remember making the decision to hide. My body just moved on its own, pulling me deeper into the trailer, away from the door. Josh and Amber ducked down behind a couch that was leaking stuffing, and Kevin pressed himself against the wall near the bathroom. The woman on the floor didn't react at all, just kept staring at nothing with that slack expression. Then there were voices outside, men's voices, speaking in quick Spanish that I couldn't fully understand. But the tone was clear. They were angry about something. A flashlight beam swept through the open door and someone shouted, asking who was out there, who'd been in their property. The beam landed on Stephanie, who'd only made it halfway to the truck before the lights came on. She stood there like a deer on the highway, caught completely, and I watched through the grimy window as 3 men emerged from between the trailers. They weren't what I expected. No face tattoos or gang colors, just regular-looking guys in work clothes, the kind you'd see at any construction site or farm supply store. One of them had a pistol tucked into his waistband. He walked up to Stephanie and asked her real calm where her friends were. Said he knew she hadn't come alone because he'd seen the truck. She didn't answer, couldn't answer probably, and he grabbed her arm and started walking her toward the center of the circle, toward the other trailers we hadn't explored yet. That's when Josh made the stupidest decision of his life and ran out after her. He was yelling something about leaving her alone, about how we were just kids and we'd leave and never come back. But his voice cracked halfway through and it just sounded pathetic and desperate. The man with the gun didn't even hesitate. He pulled it out and pointed it at Josh's chest, told him to get on his knees right now or he'd put a hole in him. Josh dropped like his legs had been cut out from under him. Amber started crying next to me, these quiet hiccuping sobs she was trying to muffle with her hand, and I clamped my own hand over her mouth because I knew if they heard us, we were done. Through the window I watched as 2 more men appeared, one of them talking on a cell phone in rapid Spanish, and I caught enough words to understand they were calling someone, asking what to do about the kids who'd found the place. The man on the phone kept saying CC and nodding, and when he hung up, his face looked grim. He walked over to Josh and Stephanie and told them they were going to take a little walk, that if they cooperated, nobody had to get hurt. Josh asked what about his friends in the truck, lying badly, and the man smiled this thin smile and said they'd find them too, not to worry. They started walking, the 2 of them, toward the far side of the circle, toward trailers I now realized had been modified somehow, with metal reinforcements around the doors and windows that looked like bars. Kevin whispered that we had to run, right now while they were distracted, but I couldn't move. I was watching Josh and Stephanie being led away and my brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. Then the woman on the floor behind us started making this horrible keening sound, this animal noise of pure distress, and one of the men heard it. He turned back toward our trailer and started walking, calling out to someone named Luis, saying he needed to check on the girl in number 7. That was us. We were in number 7. Amber bolted first, running out the back window that someone had left partially open, and Kevin went right after her. I should have followed immediately, but I hesitated for maybe 3 seconds, looking at that woman on the floor, who was clearly a prisoner here, clearly someone who needed help. And those 3 seconds cost me everything. The man came through the door just as I was climbing toward the window, and he grabbed my ankle and pulled hard. I hit the floor, and all the air went out of my lungs, and when I looked up, there was a different man standing over me, older than the others, with graying hair and these absolutely dead eyes. He said something in Spanish to the guy holding me, then switched to English and told me I'd made a very big mistake tonight. That they'd been running a good operation here for 2 years without problems, and now they had to figure out what to do with a bunch of nosy kids who couldn't mind their own business. They zip-tied my hands behind my back and walked me to one of the modified trailers, the one with the heaviest bars on the windows. Inside it was divided into compartments, these small rooms created with plywood walls that didn't reach the ceiling, and I could hear people in the other sections, breathing, shifting, someone crying softly. They shoved me into one of these rooms and the door had a padlock on the outside, just like that first trailer. The space was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with a thin mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. There was sound insulation stapled to the walls, the kind you see in recording studios, which explained why nobody outside had ever heard anything from this place. Josh was in the compartment next to mine. I could hear him through the thin plywood, asking if I was okay, his voice shaking. Stephanie was somewhere further down, calling out for Amber and Kevin, begging them to get help. One of the men banged on the wall and told us to shut up or he'd give us something to really cry about. The hours that followed are the blurriest part of my memory. I know we were kept in those rooms while they decided what to do with us. I know they brought us water and these protein bars that tasted like cardboard, keeping us alive but barely. I know Josh tried to kick his door down at some point and they came in and beat him badly enough that he stopped making noise for a long time. What I learned later, after everything, was that Amber and Kevin had made it back to the highway. They'd run through that cornfield in complete darkness, getting cut up by the dried stalks, and flagged down a semi-truck around 3 in the morning. The driver let them use his CB radio to call for help, and they told the police everything: the trailer park, the men with guns, their 3 friends who'd been taken. But here's the thing about Kansas County police departments at 3 in the morning. They're understaffed and skeptical, especially when 2 drunk teenagers show up with a story about armed men and kidnapping in an abandoned trailer park that most locals didn't even know existed. The officer who responded thought they were either pulling a prank or had gotten into some kind of drug deal gone wrong. He drove out to Highway 56 with them at dawn, but couldn't find the turnoff they described. That spray-painted arrow on the mailbox was gone, painted over with brown that matched the rust. The dirt road through the cornfield had been smoothed out somehow, and without that clear path, the officer didn't want to drive his cruiser through private farmland on the word of 2 scared kids who couldn't give him an exact location. He took a report and told them he'd follow up, but Amber said she could tell he didn't believe them. It took 3 days and both sets of parents raising hell before the sheriff's department organized a real search, and by then we'd been moved. They transported us at night in a panel van with no windows, drove for what felt like hours on roads that went from paved to gravel to dirt. When they finally let us out, we were at a different location entirely, some kind of warehouse or industrial building that smelled like chemicals and had these huge ventilation fans running constantly. The operation was bigger than I'd understood. There were maybe 20 other people being held there, ranging from teenagers to people in their 40s, all in various states of withdrawal or sedation. I realized we'd stumbled into something way beyond a local drug operation. They were using people as mules, as labor, as leverage against family members who owed money. The man with the dead eyes, the one who seemed to be in charge, told us we'd work off our debt for trespassing and causing problems. He said we'd ruined a good setup and cost them money and having to relocate, so now we owed them. Josh kept insisting we were just kids, that our parents would pay whatever they wanted, but the man laughed and said our parents couldn't pay what we'd cost them. For weeks, maybe months, time stopped meaning anything in that place. We sorted pills, packaged powder into baggies, loaded and unloaded trucks that came in the middle of the night. They kept us compliant with just enough food to function and occasional doses of something that made everything feel far away and unimportant. Stephanie stopped talking after the first week. Josh tried to escape once and they broke 3 of his fingers as a lesson to the rest of us. The fragmented memories I have are mostly from this period. Days blending together, the constant noise of those ventilation fans, the chemical taste in my mouth that never went away. But I also remember the moment everything changed. A woman showed up one day, someone new they'd brought in, and she was different from the rest of us. She wasn't scared. She was angry, loudly, violently angry, screaming at the guards about a lawyer and her husband and how people knew where she was. They tried to shut her up, but she wouldn't stop, and I think that's what finally brought attention to the place, because 3 days after she arrived, I woke up to the sound of doors being smashed in and men in tactical gear yelling for everyone to get on the ground. Federal agents, it turned out, DEA and FBI. They'd been investigating the drug ring for over a year, but couldn't find their main distribution center until this woman, a county prosecutor's wife who'd been grabbed by mistake, a case of mistaken identity, went missing, and her husband tore apart every lead with resources we never had. They raided 4 locations simultaneously that morning in January, recovered 37 people total, and arrested 23 men connected to an operation that stretched from the Midwest to the East Coast. Josh, Stephanie, and I were separated immediately, taken to different hospitals, debriefed by so many different agencies that their faces all blur together now. My parents cried when they saw me, and I couldn't cry back. I'd forgotten how, somewhere in those months. The worst part was learning that Kevin had died 2 weeks after escaping. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage, his truck running, officially ruled an accident, but everyone who knew him understood what it really was. The guilt of leaving us behind had eaten him alive. They tell me I should feel lucky to be alive, that most people in situations like ours don't come home at all. The prosecutors used our testimony to put away the main operators for life, and the FBI shut down the entire network. That trailer park off Highway 56 was bulldozed within a month of our rescue. The whole area fenced off and turned into nothing, like it never existed at all. Josh moved to Colorado with his family right after the trials ended. I heard he's doing better now, working at a ski resort, trying to build a normal life. Stephanie's in intensive therapy somewhere on the East Coast. Her parents won't say where exactly. Amber finished high school online and left town the day she turned 18. I stayed because running felt like letting them win, even though I see that warehouse every time I close my eyes and smell those chemicals every time it rains. My high school graduating class walked in 2014 and I wasn't there. I was still doing physical therapy, still trying to remember how to be a person instead of just a body that follows orders. Sometimes people recognize me around town, the kid who survived that thing with the drug trailers, and they get this look like they want to ask questions but don't know how. I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to ask either. The detectives say my fragmented memory is normal for trauma, that pieces might come back or they might not, and I should focus on moving forward instead of trying to reconstruct everything. But here's what I know for certain. There are more places like that warehouse out there. More operations running right now in spaces people drive past every day without noticing. And there are still people in those places, waiting for someone to stumble across them the way we did, hoping their luck turns out better than ours. My cousin Rita had this way of making everything seem fixable, even when it wasn't. Wednesday evening in January 2024, I sat at her kitchen table just outside Springfield, Missouri, signing papers that ended my marriage while she heated up leftover pot roast and told me about her plans for spring planting. My birthday had passed the week before. 39 felt different than 38 somehow, heavier. And here I was starting from scratch with a new apartment in town, and a job that kept me staring at wrecked cars all day. Insurance adjusting pays decent, but it teaches you to see damage everywhere, calculate loss like it's just numbers on a form. Rita kept the conversation light, asked about work, avoided mentioning my ex-wife's name. By the time I left around 7, the sun had already set, leaving that dead gray light that makes Missouri winter feel twice as cold. County Road 48 was my usual route home, 40 minutes of farmland and scattered houses set so far back from the road you could barely see them. I'd driven it 100 times, knew every curve and dip. Around mile marker 31, my 2015 Ford F-150 started making this grinding noise that shot straight through the floorboard. The engine shuddered hard, the whole truck vibrated, and then everything just quit. I managed to coast onto the shoulder near a beaten mailbox with Pruitt spray-painted crooked across the front. Tried the ignition 3 times, got nothing but clicking and that horrible metal-on-metal sound. One car passed without slowing, taillights vanishing around the bend like it couldn't get away fast enough. I pulled out my phone, saw 2 bars of signal, and searched for a tow truck. Most of the big companies showed wait times over an hour. Then I found Anchor Towing. Local number, promised 15-minute response, available all hours. I called, and a man answered so fast I barely heard it ring, his voice gravelly and worn, like he'd been waiting by the phone. He asked where I was, and I told him County Road 48, near the Pruitt mailbox at mile marker 31. He didn't ask for more details, didn't need the make and model of my truck, nothing about what was wrong with it. Just said, "Yeah, I know where that is. Be there in 10, and hung up before I could even say thanks. The whole call lasted maybe 20 seconds. I sat there in the cab, heater still blowing cold air because the engine was dead, and realized I hadn't asked about the price or what shop he was taking me to. But honestly, I just wanted to get home, peel off these clothes that still smelled like Rita's kitchen, and sleep for about 12 hours straight. The road stayed empty. No headlights in either direction, just the wind pushing dead leaves across the asphalt, and the distant shape of a barn I could barely make out against the darkening sky. Then, headlights appeared from the direction I'd come, moving fast. Way faster than you'd expect a tow truck to move, especially on a road like this with all its turns. The lights swept around the bend, and I could see it wasn't one of those big professional rigs with the company name plastered across the side in bright letters. It was a Chevy Silverado, maybe early 2000s, dark blue or black, hard to tell in the fading light. It had a tow bar welded to the back, and one of those yellow rotating beacons on the roof. The kind you can buy at any auto parts store and stick on with a magnet. On the driver's door was a decal, Anchor Towing, with an anchor symbol and a phone number, but it looked homemade, like someone had printed it on their computer and stuck it on with adhesive. The truck pulled up behind mine and the driver got out, leaving his headlights on so they lit up the whole scene in harsh white light that made everything look strange and flat. The guy who stepped out was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a stained Carhartt jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His face was hard to make out with the headlights behind him, but I could see he was older, probably in his 50s, with a gray beard that needed trimming and a baseball cap pulled low. He walked up to my window, and I rolled it down, cold air rushing in. He smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, that combination every mechanic seems to carry around like cologne. "Engine's done, huh?" he said, not really asking. His voice was the same one from the phone, rough and flat, no warmth in it. I nodded and explained the grinding noise, how everything just died, and he listened without looking at me, his eyes scanning my truck like he was appraising it. When I finished talking, he just said, "I'll hook you up, take you to my shop. It's about 20 minutes from here, just off Highway 12. He didn't mention a price, didn't ask if I wanted to call anyone, didn't hand me a business card or a form to sign. He worked fast, moving around to the back of my truck with a chain that clanked loud in the quiet. I got out to watch, mostly because sitting in the cab doing nothing made me feel useless, and also because some part of me, the part that spends all day documenting accident scenes, wanted to see how he was rigging it up. The setup looked solid enough, chains looped through the frame, hooks secured, but there was something sloppy about it, like he'd done this 1,000 times and stopped caring about the details. He worked without talking, didn't make small talk about the weather or ask what I did for a living, none of that casual conversation tow truck drivers usually throw at you to fill the silence. When he finished, he straightened up and said, "You can ride with me or stay in your truck, doesn't matter." His tone made it clear he didn't care either way. I hesitated, looking between his Silverado and my F-150, and something in my gut twitched, just a small, uncomfortable feeling I couldn't name. But I was tired, emotionally wrung out, and this guy was my ride. I told him I'd stay in my truck. He shrugged like I'd just told him the sky was blue and walked back to his Silverado without another word. I climbed into my F-150, settled into the driver's seat even though I had no control anymore, and watched through the rear window as he got into his truck. The engine rumbled to life, louder than it should have been, and then we started moving. The jerk when we first pulled onto the road was rough, rattled my teeth, but then it smoothed out into this weird gliding feeling, being pulled along by someone else's momentum. I kept my phone in my hand, screen lit up showing 7:30, and watched the road slide past in reverse through my side mirror. We went maybe 2 miles before he made a turn I didn't recognize, onto a narrower road with no street sign, just gravel and dirt packed hard from years of use. Trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping the top of my truck with this rhythmic scratching sound that set my nerves on edge. That's when I realized I had no idea where this shop was supposed to be. He'd said Highway 12, but we were heading away from it, deeper into back roads I'd never been on. I tried to remember if there were any repair shops out this way and came up blank. My phone still had one bar of signal, just barely hanging on. I thought about calling Rita, telling her where I was, but what would I even say? That I had a bad feeling about the tow truck driver who was doing exactly what I'd paid him to do. That sounded paranoid, like the stress of the day was making me see danger where there wasn't any. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the phone tighter, and I kept watching the trees pass by, looking for something familiar, some landmark that would tell me we were going the right direction. Nothing. Just more trees, more darkness, and that horrible scratching sound every time a branch dragged across my roof. Then he turned again, onto an even smaller road, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, and the pavement gave way entirely to dirt. The beacon on his roof kept spinning, throwing yellow light across the trees in sick rotating patterns. We'd been driving for maybe 15 minutes when he slowed down near a clearing on the left side of the road. Through the windshield, I could see the outline of a structure, maybe a shed or a small building, set back about 30 feet from the road. No lights on inside, no sign, nothing that looked like a legitimate repair shop. Just a dark shape against darker trees. My entire body went rigid. This wasn't right. None of this was right. He pulled to a stop and the Silverado's engine kept running, that rough idle vibrating through the chains into my truck. I watched him in the side mirror, saw him open his door and step out, moving toward the back where the chains were connected. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to do something, but I was hooked to his truck, couldn't drive away even if my engine worked. My phone showed no signal now, just an empty bar mocking me in the corner of the screen. I locked my doors, stupid, pointless, but it was all I could think to do. He appeared at my window, standing there in the yellow rotating light, and tapped on the glass with his knuckle. Not aggressive, just a casual tap, like he had all the time in the world. I didn't roll it down. Through the glass, I could see his face clearly now, and there was something empty in his expression, mechanical, like he was going through motions he'd rehearsed. He said something I couldn't hear through the window, gestured toward the building. I shook my head, held up my phone, pointed at the screen showing no signal, then made a gesture like I was calling someone. Universal sign for, I'm not getting out. I have people who know where I am. Complete lie, but I sold it hard. His face didn't change. He stood there for what felt like 10 minutes but was probably 30 seconds, just staring at me through the glass. Then he did something I wasn't expecting. He pulled out his own phone, looked at it, put it back in his pocket and walked back to his truck without saying another word. I heard his door slam and then nothing happened. We just sat there, his engine running, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then headlights appeared behind us, coming up the dirt road fast. A vehicle rounded the bend, high beams cutting through the darkness, and I've never been so relieved to see another human being in my entire life. It was a patrol car, county sheriff, and it pulled up maybe 20 feet behind the Silverado with its lights going. A deputy got out, flashlight in hand, and walked up to the driver's side of the tow truck. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the deputy's posture change, see him step back and put his hand near his belt. The conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes, and then the deputy walked over to my window. I rolled it down immediately, cold air rushing in along with the sound of the deputy's radio crackling. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a clean-shaved face and sharp eyes that took in everything. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked, and his voice had that careful calm cops use when they think something's wrong, but don't want to spook anyone. I told him I'd called for a tow. My truck broke down on County Road 48, and this guy showed up saying he'd take me to his shop. The deputy nodded slowly, glanced back at the Silverado, then asked me, "Did you get a card or any paperwork from him?" I said no, and his jaw tightened just slightly. The deputy told me to stay put and walked back to the Silverado. Whatever he said to the driver made the guy get out of his truck with his hands visible, and within minutes another patrol car showed up, then another. They had the driver standing by the hood of his Silverado, talking to him, checking his identification, running something on their radios. One of the deputies came over and explained they'd been looking for this guy for 3 weeks. Apparently there'd been a string of incidents, people calling for tow trucks on rural roads, drivers showing up fast with homemade decals and no legitimate business license, then either robbing the stranded motorists or, in 2 cases, the people in their vehicles just vanished entirely until their trucks were found abandoned days later in different counties. The fake tow driver would target people alone on empty roads, use the isolation against them, and the decal on his door could peel right off when he was done. They'd been tracking reports but couldn't pin him down until tonight. The deputy said the only reason they found me was because someone had called in a suspicious vehicle, matching the description heading down this road. Probably a neighbor who'd seen the beacon light through the trees and thought it was strange. They unhooked my truck right there on the dirt road and called a legitimate towing company out of Springfield to come get me. Took another hour before they arrived, and I spent that time sitting in the back of a patrol car with a blanket around my shoulders, watching them process the scene. The building in the clearing turned out to be an abandoned hunting cabin. Nothing inside but some old furniture, and evidence of other people having been there recently. Rope, duct tape, a toolbox. The deputy who'd found me said I'd gotten lucky in ways I probably didn't fully understand yet. That staying in my truck and refusing to get out had likely saved my life. When the real tow truck finally showed up, a bright red rig with the company name in huge letters and a driver who had paperwork and a business card, and asked me a dozen questions about my insurance, I felt like I could breathe again. They took me and my F-150 to a shop in town, and I called Rita from there around midnight to tell her what happened. She cried, which made me realize how close I'd actually come to not making that call at all. The guy they arrested turned out to have a record: assault, theft, a bunch of other charges going back years. I had to give a statement to the police, went through the whole thing again in detail, and they told me I'd probably have to testify if it went to trial. I said I would, absolutely, whatever they needed. That was 3 months ago now, and I still won't drive County Road 48 at night. Still check the credentials of any service person before they touch my vehicle. Still get a knot in my chest when I see a tow truck beacon spinning in the dark. Some guy in a fake uniform with a homemade decal almost made me disappear. And the only reason I'm here typing this is because I listened to that small, uncomfortable feeling in my gut and refused to get out of my truck. Trust that feeling. Always. Folks around our town always said the bridge at Mason Creek had a bad feeling to it. It sits about 3 miles past the diner where I work, tucked behind a patch of pine trees and fog that never really lifts. The asphalt there crumbles into dirt, and when the wind blows through, it whistles through the cracks like the bridge is breathing. I had lived in Claymore all my life, waiting tables since I was 18, and I knew every regular's car by sight. That is why, when I drove home after my shift one night and saw a silver Honda parked near the guardrail with no lights on, it caught my attention immediately. At first, I figured someone broke down. Happens all the time when folks take the back roads to avoid the state patrol. But when I passed by the next night and saw a different car in almost the same spot, an old maroon Buick this time, I felt a strange sense of repetition that stuck with me. People in town started whispering about it too. A delivery guy said he'd seen 3 cars left there in the last week, always after midnight, always gone by morning. Nobody knew who they belonged to, and nobody really wanted to stop and check. Then came the night I noticed a beat-up blue Ford Fusion parked right under the bridge's main arch. I recognized it right away. It belonged to Casey, one of the waitresses who worked the late shift with me at the diner. Casey had been covering extra hours because her boyfriend lost his job, and she usually left around the same time I did. Seeing her car sitting there, engine off, door slightly cracked open, made my chest tighten in a way I can't fully describe. I pulled over a little ahead of the bridge, cut the headlights, and just sat there, watching the Ford. The whole place was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The bridge lights had gone out years ago, so the only thing I could see was the faint gleam of metal from the car's bumper catching my high beams. I called Casey's phone, no answer. Tried again, nothing. That was when I noticed a faint flicker of light inside her car, like someone using a flashlight or maybe a lighter. It blinked twice, then disappeared. For a few seconds I thought about turning around and pretending I never saw it. But curiosity has always been my worst habit. I stepped out of my car, leaving the engine idling just in case I needed to bolt. The air smelled like wet iron, sharp and heavy. My shoes crunched against the gravel as I moved closer to Casey's car, calling her name softly. No answer. I peeked through the driver's window and saw her purse still on the seat, her phone face down beside it, the screen cracked. But the back seat was empty. That small light I'd seen earlier wasn't there anymore, and the silence felt deeper, as if the woods had stopped breathing too. Something about that bridge always messed with radios, but I had my work walkie-talkie in my apron pocket from the diner. It wasn't meant for long distance, yet a faint voice came through when I turned it on. Static first, then a man's voice. Steady, low, like he was talking right next to my ear. "You out here too?" he said. I froze in place, listening. The signal hissed, then he spoke again. "Bridge is quiet tonight, just the way I like it." His tone was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. I backed away from the car, keeping my eyes on the dark stretch of bridge ahead. There were faint tire marks near the guardrail, fresh ones that hadn't been there before. That was when I heard it. The slow grind of a diesel engine starting somewhere beyond the trees. The kind of deep rumble you feel in your ribs. The sound echoed under the bridge, bouncing around like it had nowhere else to go. I crouched behind Casey's car, heart hammering, and watched as a semi-truck's headlights blinked on in the distance. It crept forward like it was stalking something. The driver never used the horn, never flashed the brights, just rolled closer until the grille reflected in the water beneath the bridge. I caught a glimpse of the trailer's paint, dull red with peeling white letters that might have once spelled a company name. I remember thinking that whoever was behind that wheel wasn't just passing through. They were waiting. The truck stopped in the middle of the bridge, its headlights dimmed, leaving everything bathed in weak moonlight. A voice crackled through my walkie again. Same man, same calm tone. "She came out to meet me, you know. Said she heard me calling." My chest tightened. Casey had told me once she liked to listen to old CB channels while closing up the diner. Said they made the drive home less lonely. The man kept talking, describing her hair, her voice, how she sounded scared when she realized there was no signal down here. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move fast enough. Then the truck's door opened. I could see the driver's outline against the cab light, broad shoulders, baseball cap, face hidden by shadow. He leaned out and tossed something over the bridge rail. It hit the water with a soft splash. I felt my throat close up. The radio clicked again, quieter now. Sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't. His engine roared back to life, and the truck rolled off into the trees, taillights fading until the night swallowed them whole. I didn't go to the police until morning. When they checked the bridge, they found Casey's phone, the same one I'd seen in her car, shattered near the guardrail. They said the signal from her last call had bounced off an unregistered frequency, one the highway patrol hadn't used in decades. A few weeks later, they traced similar disappearances to truck stops along the interstate, each near a bridge, each victim last heard talking on CB channels no one was supposed to be using anymore. To this day, that stretch of road stays empty after dark. People in Claymore say it's haunted, but I don't think it's ghosts keeping folks away. Sometimes late at night, the diner's radio picks up faint chatter from a channel that shouldn't exist. just a man's voice, clear as if he's sitting at the counter. "Anyone out there near the bridge?" he says. "It's real quiet tonight." Classes had been exhausting that semester, and I was desperate for a quiet weekend to make some money. When my roommate mentioned a family who needed a babysitter for 2 nights, it felt like a perfect break from the campus chaos. The family lived in a tidy 2-story house on the edge of a small Oregon town. Quiet, tree-lined streets where everyone seemed to know each other. The mother, Erin, met me at the door with the kind of warmth that felt practiced, but not unkind. Her husband, Patrick, was supposedly leaving that evening for a business trip to Portland, and the 2 kids, Max and Lily, were already in their pajamas when I arrived. Erin gave me a quick tour of the house, moving a little too fast through each room, pointing out the snacks, the camera monitors, the back door, the alarm code. She kept saying how much she appreciated me coming on short notice. Her voice trembled just slightly when she mentioned Patrick's trip, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Before she left, she kissed both kids on the forehead, reminded me not to open the door for anyone, and promised to be back by late morning. When the door clicked shut, the silence in that big house felt heavier than it should have. The night started out fine. Max and Lily were good kids, restless but polite. We played a board game, watched an old animated movie, and they fell asleep by 9. After cleaning up the living room, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. The only light came from the little night bulb over the sink, making everything look faded and distant. The house felt peaceful, almost too still, like it was waiting for something. Around midnight, the first knock came. 3 dull taps on the back door, slow and deliberate. I figured it might be a neighbor, someone who had noticed Erin's car gone and wanted to check in. Still, something in the rhythm of those knocks made me hesitate. I opened the kitchen tablet to check the porch camera. The grainy feed lit up, and I swear my breath caught when I saw the man on the screen. Patrick, standing there in the cold, his face lit by the porch light. At first I thought maybe the trip had been canceled, but something about the way he stood there, completely still, staring straight into the camera, made my throat tighten. He wasn't knocking anymore, just standing in the same position, his hands at his sides. The porch light flickered once, and the feed glitched for half a second. When it came back, he was gone. I remember walking to the door and checking the lock twice before stepping back and texting Erin. No answer. Then I called her. Straight to voicemail. A few minutes later, a soft scratching sound came from the side of the house, like branches scraping the siding, except there were no trees close enough for that. I turned off the kitchen light to get a clearer view through the window. Outside, the yard looked empty. The swing set in the corner moved slightly, just enough to catch the light. I could not tell if it was the wind or something else. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I grabbed the house phone. Yes, an actual landline, and kept it next to me. When the knocks started again, they were louder, faster. The kids upstairs began to stir. I heard Max's small voice call out, asking if everything was okay. I lied and told him it was just a neighbor. My voice must have sounded wrong because he came to the top of the stairs, clutching a blanket. I told him to stay with his sister, locked the kitchen door again, and turned the deadbolt twice. Then I checked the camera feed one more time. Patrick was back. His face was closer now, his expression flat, as if he were watching something beyond the lens. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers, whispering the address while keeping my eyes on the screen. The dispatcher asked me if I was sure it was the homeowner. I said yes, absolutely sure. She told me officers were on their way and to stay inside. I remember feeling this strange mixture of relief and disbelief. I had seen his face earlier that evening when he hugged the kids goodbye. There was no mistaking him, but the man on that screen looked wrong somehow. The same features, same clothes, but a blankness in his eyes that I can't describe. The police took about 15 minutes to arrive, though it felt much longer. During that time, I kept every light in the house off and sat at the bottom of the stairs listening. I could hear something faint outside, footsteps crunching against the gravel, slow and uneven. Then the sound of a car door shutting somewhere nearby. I waited for a knock at the front door, but it never came. When red and blue lights finally flashed through the curtains, I ran to open the door before they even stepped out of the car. 2 officers searched the property while one stayed with me and the kids. They found footprints near the back porch, leading toward the woods that bordered the neighborhood. I remember one of them saying the prints matched heavy boots, not sneakers or dress shoes. When they ran Patrick's name through their system, the mood shifted instantly. One of the officers made a quick call and stepped outside. A few minutes later, he came back pale-faced and told me Patrick was confirmed to be in Portland. His body had been found in a motel parking lot earlier that evening. Aaron returned the next morning in tears, escorted by detectives. The truth unfolded in fragments. Months of violence hidden behind closed doors, reports she never filed, neighbors who suspected but stayed quiet. Patrick had apparently left town 2 days earlier after a violent argument, but something or someone wearing his face came back that night. The officers never found any signs of forced entry, and the camera feed from that moment somehow vanished from the cloud storage before they could retrieve it. I quit babysitting after that. Aaron and the kids moved away not long later. Every once in a while, I'll see a man on the street with the same posture, the same way of standing perfectly still like Patrick did on that porch. And for a second, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like the air is too thick. I try not to think about what I saw on that screen, or who, if anyone, was actually standing outside that door.